Inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de TradingPRO TV.
Muy buenas a todos, ¿qué tal estáis? Espero que muy bien. Vamos a arrancar, como siempre, Más que Mercados en TradingPRO Televisión. Les habla José Basagoiti, 3:30 de la tarde, hora española. Estamos grabando desde Madrid, en directo a estudios de TradingPRO. Y para segundos de la apertura, ahí suenan las campanas de Wall Street, apertura del mercado del contado. Abre Nueva York y lo hace con bolsas planas, muy planas en Wall Street. Venía recuperando el mercado de futuros, luego cayendo un poquito, bueno, poco movimiento, a pesar de nuevo, las palabras de Donald Trump que tuvimos la madrugada pasada, ya confirmando los aranceles sobre el acero y el aluminio. Y bueno, también esos aranceles recíprocos a todos aquellos países que ya tuviesen tarifas sobre Estados Unidos más altas que Estados Unidos sobre ellos mismos. Por lo tanto, parece que, insisto, la guerra comercial va cogiendo forma. Vamos a ver en próximos meses cómo se va digiriendo todo esto, pero el mercado parece que cada vez le hace menos caso, ¿no?, a esta amenaza o a esta ejecución de guerra comercial de Donald Trump. Como yo siempre digo, esto es un ataque frontal al libre mercado. Desde TradingPRO sabéis que no estamos nada de acuerdo en la ejecución de tarifas, de aranceles, a pesar de que muchos analistas insisten de que esto es una defensa frente a una competencia desleal de otros países. Bueno, como digo, es un argumento desde mi punto de vista un poco estéril, algo pobre. En primer lugar, nosotros a priori somos los occidentes, los que han luchado, los que han implementado el libre comercio, el capitalismo, y no tenemos que copiar la mala praxis de otras economías. Y en caso de haberlas, de otros países, por ejemplo China, o Vietnam, o Tanzania, o incluso México y Canadá, hayan aplicado competencias desleales, es decir, que se hayan aprovechado de las subvenciones públicas para desarrollar cierta industria y producir ciertos productos, esto tiene las patas muy cortas. Realmente, si se subvenciona a una industria, es porque esa industria no es competitiva, necesita ayudas del contribuyente, ayudas del sector público, y por lo tanto se está dilapidando dinero del contribuyente, se está empobreciendo al fin y al cabo la sociedad, y por tanto estás luchando contra un empobrecimiento, estás defendiéndote de un empobrecimiento social de otra economía. Por lo tanto hay poco que defenderse, no sé si me explico. Entonces sí, a corto plazo puede tener algo de beneficio para esa economía en contra del productor nacional, pero como digo, a medio y largo plazo no tiene mucho sentido, ya que esa subvención pública al final lo que está es subvencionando un proyecto poco rentable, poco eficiente, y se está dilapidando, se está destruyendo dinero público. Es decir, se está empobreciendo al tejido productivo, al tejido privado, al fin y al cabo, de esa economía, ¿no? Dicho esto, no vamos a entrar en detalle, es una discusión algo más teórica para la academia económica. Vamos a centrarnos en los mercados y, como digo, estaba abriendo Wall Street, lo hace sin volatilidad. Nosotros estamos buscando ya el lado largo para el Nasdaq y el S&P 500. Estamos buscando desde TradingPRO en nuestros portfolios, las carteras que operamos corporativas, como digo, ese lado largo. Seguimos teniendo estructuras de corto plazo alcistas. Es verdad que estamos en un gran lateral, llevamos varias semanas donde el precio se mueve poco, es verdad que con bandazos a la baja, al alza, a la baja, al alta, pero dentro de una gran zona de congestión, no hay tendencia, es un gran lateral, y dentro de ese rectángulo, sí estamos buscando en scalping, en intradía, para la sesión de hoy, posiciones altistas. Luego lo veremos, vamos a repasar como siempre estas estrategias con gráficos en mano, nos vamos a sentar como siempre en el set, vamos a bucear en los diferentes charts para ver esos patrones, esas setups, en este caso, como digo, buscando el lado largo en las bolsas. También Europa, hoy marcaba el DAX por máximos históricos, verdad que enseguida los ha perdido, bueno, está ahí tonteando, ¿no?, de nuevo con los récords, está muy fuerte Europa, que claramente es el caballo ganador de este inicio de año. Estamos a día 11 de febrero, llevamos poco tiempo en este año, pero el oro y las bolsas europeas claramente son los ganadores, como digo, de este inicio, ¿no? El oro ya con un 8% de performance. La verdad es que ahora mismo venía corrigiendo ligeramente. Ayer muchos analistas ya hablaban de los $3.000 por Troy como el gran objetivo, que quizá lo que hacemos a lo largo de este propio mes de febrero. También la plata está con patrones muy interesantes. Ayer analizábamos el mercado, hoy ya ha tocado la zona de soporte donde hablábamos de buscar compras. Ya estamos largos en TradingPRO, por tanto, buscando, resumiendo un poco, largos en bolsas estadounidenses, Nasdaq y S&P 500 y ya posicionados largos en plata. Un poquito las estrategias que ahora vamos a desarrollarlas, evidentemente, pero que son muy interesantes. Por cierto, hoy presenta a cierre de mercado Coca-Cola, también Gilghead, luego lo vamos a ver. Bueno, pues un poco que esperamos de esos valores. Venía cayendo, bueno, viene subiendo con fuerza también Nvidia, las últimas 2 sesiones o 3 subiendo casi un 15%, parece que se ha evaporado ese temor de DeepSeek, la IA china. Ya decíamos que, bueno, pues que era un poco tremendista, ¿no? Los análisis que se vienen haciendo de que pues el desarrollo de esta startup china iba a acabar con los inputs, ¿no? Con las GPUs de Nvidia, que no se iban a quitar tanta demanda, tampoco energética. Ya veníamos avisando que era un poco humo todo ese análisis, o muy pobre, muy reduccionista, ¿no? Todo lo que se venía comentando, y que realmente pues era una ineficiencia de mercado. Lo que había perdido Nvidia se podía recuperar. Bueno, así viene pasando, como digo, en las últimas sesiones, con un 15% ya de subida. Algo peor lo está pasando Tesla, ya sabéis, con las ventas, bueno, pues muy castigadas en Europa. Europa es curioso, porque está aumentando la venta de coches eléctricos, pero se está desplomando la venta de Teslas. Mucha gente piensa que incluso puede estar afectando esa injerencia de Elon Musk en la política europea, sobre todo en Alemania, donde, bueno, lo puede hacer, es libre de hacerlo, pero se ha mostrado muy partidario a ciertos partidos, en este caso Alianza, donde, bueno, pues no es favorito, pero bueno, quiere incluso hacer esa presión como hizo con Donald Trump en las elecciones estadounidenses, ¿no? Bueno, problemas para Tesla también lo vamos a analizar. A nivel de mercados en Forex, poco movimiento. El dólar, que es la clave de todo, ya está en zona de soporte, quizá para buscar algún largo. Luego lo vamos a repasar. Y en criptomonedas, nos va a hablar, por supuesto, nuestro compañero de batallas, Álvaro Basagoiti, cómo está el ecosistema en general, ¿no? Bitcoin y, por supuesto, las principales alts, que también están navegando en una lateralidad en las últimas horas, aunque mucho más castigadas en este inicio de año que las propias bolsas. Y por supuesto vamos a escuchar en directo hoy a Jerome Powell, presidente de la Reserva Federal, la banca central de Estados Unidos, que va a hablar ante el Senado del país. En primer lugar, dará una rueda de prensa un poquito con la política monetaria, las perspectivas de próximos meses, y luego se va a someter a las preguntas de los senadores. Así que va a estar muy interesante. Vamos a conectar en directo con Powell para ver qué dice, y por supuesto para analizar el movimiento, la volatilidad que seguramente genere, sobre todo en función de si se muestra hawkish, dovish, veremos seguramente mucha volatilidad. Así que hoy programón, tenemos análisis, voy a ir rápido porque luego, insisto, vamos a conectar en directo, en review directo con Powell para escucharle y ver lo que tiene que decir sobre las perspectivas de política monetaria, recorte de tipos, también la posibilidad de que haya QEs de vuelta o no, liquidez, el sector bancario, Donald Trump, hablará de todo eso, así que será apasionante escucharle. Y lo veremos como siempre aquí en directo, así que, como siempre, si os gusta el contenido, agradecemos, por supuesto, esos likes que nos ayuden en el posicionamiento, que mucha más gente pueda venir a vernos, ¿verdad? Hacer crecer esta espectacular comunidad que tiene un desafío, creo que muy noble, y es llevar la educación financiera a todos los rincones hispanohablantes del mundo. Bueno, no me voy a enrollar más, hemos hecho un pequeño análisis fundamental, pero vamos ya a saludar a nuestro compañero de batallas, Álvaro Basagoiti, para ver qué estrategias tiene, que la comparta con nosotros, y por supuesto empezamos ya a bucear en los gráficos. Os espero a todos en el set.
Ya está aquí. Ya está disponible nuestro curso definitivo de trading. No importa si eres un principiante o un experto en inversiones, este curso está diseñado para guiarte en cada paso del camino. Aprenderás sobre educación en independencia financiera, estructura del precio Fibonacci, ondas Elliott, lectura Wyckoff y mucho más. Pero lo más importante es que Álvaro y José Basagoiti te enseñarán a aplicar el exclusivo sistema de TradingPRO. No esperes más para comenzar tu aprendizaje. Visita tradingpro.app ahora y elige la opción que mejor se adapte a tus necesidades. ¿Y sabes qué es lo mejor? Si ya eres parte de la familia TradingPRO o has seguido nuestro programa en directo, te espera un descuento especial. Contáctanos hoy mismo para obtener el tuyo y aprovechar esta increíble oportunidad. La educación financiera cambia vidas.
Hola amigos, hola compañeros, hola familia, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo andamos? Feliz martes, lo primero a todos, Día de la Mujer hoy, o sea que felicidades también a todas las mujeres que nos estáis viendo por aquí, como siempre, también las parroquianas que decimos, ¿no? Estamos a martes 11 de febrero, también hoy con sesión movillita, ahora además veremos si agita un poco el árbol, ¿no? El señor Jerome Powell, un árbol que prácticamente está agitando Donald Trump todos los días. Y ahí se agitó también bastante con esa guerra, lo comentábamos en los titulares, de Elon Musk y Sam Altman, ¿no? Que ya sabéis que le hizo una oferta le hizo una oferta a Elon Musk, por OpenAI a Sam Altman por 97.000 millones. En tono jocoso le dijo cordialmente que no, que si él quiere vender X Twitter por 9.000 millones, le quitó un cero, ¿no? A la oferta. Y luego, bueno, salió Elon Musk poniendo un tweet, en vez de Sam Altman le ponía Scam Altman, ¿no? Scam de Timo. Ahí están, pegándose leches todos los días por las redes sociales. Decía el propio en una entrevista a Elon Musk que él fundó también OpenAI, le puso ese nombre. OpenAI es IA abierta, inteligencia artificial abierta, porque empezó siendo un proyecto sin ánimo de lucro y de código abierto. Y ahora ha cambiado, se fue Elon y empezó esta guerra, y Salman lo que está haciendo es que sea una IA de código cerrado, ya no es código abierto, y eso de sin ánimo de lucro, pues parece que se quiere comprar, o que quiere comprar parte de la empresa Salman, y que quiere luego vender acciones por 10.000 millones de dólares. Bueno, está haciendo un movimiento raro, desde luego la guerra sigue, y estamos viendo, bueno, cada día vemos movimientos interesantes en la inteligencia artificial. Ayer tocó este duelo, este combate de boxeo, ¿verdad?, entre Elon Musk, todavía la persona más rica del mundo, y Sam Altman, 97.000 millones, como quien no dice la cosa. Ya se compró Twitter, si no recuerdo mal, por 44.000 millones, ahí haciendo ofertas. Bueno, era un consorcio de inversores con Elon Musk a la cabeza, Ayer tuvimos un poco de salseo, vamos a ver cómo lo tenemos también hoy, que hay muchas cosas que comentar. Os estaba leyendo, como siempre por aquí, los parroquianos y parroquianas. Jaime Alonso nos saluda, muy buenas tardes, también lo hace José Manuel Martínez, muy buenas. Tenemos también a Brian Barrientos, también, que nos saluda desde Chile, sí señor, Brian. Vamos también, bueno, Ligia, Monly, buenas tardes también, Online Store, Apple y Alibaba, ¿no? Hola, buenas, acaban de anunciar asociación entre Apple y Alibaba para reproducir la IA de Alibaba en teléfonos iPhone. Interesante esa información de Online Store, tremendo, por cierto, también, fijaos, que hablando de IA, ya que nos ha este dato interesantísimo, también veamos cómo quiere dejar de depender OpenAI de Nvidia. Lo estamos comentando justo en la noticia, ¿no? También en el canal abierto de Telegram que tenemos, donde os invitamos a todos. Os dejamos como siempre los links en YouTube, los que nos veis de Twitter, los que nos veis de Twitch, iros a YouTube a darle a suscribiros a este canal de Telegram. Y decíamos que han hecho un acuerdo también para producir sus propios chips, es decir, OpenAI quiere producir con Taiwan Semiconductores sus propios chips y dejar de depender de Nvidia, una Nvidia que ahora veremos también y analizaremos cómo también viene subiendo. Aupas likes, sí señor, buenas tardes, ALCC, a Mari también nos saluda. Pueden ver el petróleo, claro, está justo rompiendo la bajista el petróleo, ya echamos un ojo, porque está también dejando aumentos interesantes, esa posibilidad de que, ha dicho Donald Trump, ha avisado a los grupos terroristas de Hamas que, ojo, si no entregan todos los rehenes, creo que es hasta el día 12, hasta mañana, no sé hasta qué es, eso tengo que comprobarlo, pero que van a vivir el infierno en la tierra, esa amenaza de Donald Trump a los terroristas de Hamas. O sea que puede dejar a ver alto el fuego ahí, y por eso el petróleo también puede estar rebotando, Otra razón, está subiendo Baba mientras las demás chinas caen. Baba, nosotros ya sabéis que tenemos una posición fuerte en Alibaba, una empresa que nos gusta mucho para largo plazo. Buenas tardes, un saludo desde Sanse, por fin parece que explota Alibaba. Ahí está, echamos un ojo a Alibaba, que estáis hablando mucho del gigante, del dragón dormido asiático, pero tenemos mucho por ver. Por lo tanto, de momento quiero ver cómo está abriendo, como siempre, nos gusta analizar, nos gusta ver el mapa de calor. Hoy yo me he traído un té rojo y creo que he hecho bien. A mí me gusta más personalmente el té rojo que el té verde, pero bueno, como siempre, muchas veces tenemos días verdes. Y mirad, hoy tenemos, quitando Apple, que viene subiendo, esa es la noticia que nos ha dado nuestro compi de noticia, acuerdo con Alibaba, subiendo un 1,05%, pero en general, otra vez, sector financiero, ayer cayó mucho y también viene cayendo, bueno, viene cayendo casi todo, quitando muy plano Google, muy plano Microsoft, muy plano Meta. Tesla también viene cayendo un 0,77% hoy, Walmart también viene cayendo, es decir, hoy en general está más teñido de rojo, con Apple subiendo bastante. Apple y Nvidia, las más grandes, es verdad que están tirando un poquito el carro. También, bueno, Nvidia más 0,26 también subiendo ligeramente. Y, por cierto, había dicho José que presentaba Coca-Cola al cierre, no, presentaba Coca-Cola antes, ya ha presentado Coca-Cola buenos resultados, Ahí los tenemos en pantalla, mejor
Earning per stock, mejor beneficio por acción, de 0,52 a 0,55, y también superando en ingresos, de 10,7 a 11,5. Ayer resultados nefastos de McDonald's, muy malos resultados de McDonald's, que está perdiendo cuota de mercado, está perdiendo ingresos, está perdiendo beneficios. Fijaos, por ejemplo, en comida rápida, cómo Chipotle va para arriba y cómo McDonald's va claramente para abajo. Lo que sí que tenemos al cierre es Super Micro Computer. Luego estaremos pendientes de esta empresa de inteligencia también artificial, Super Micro Computer. Esto sí que será al cierre. Ahí, como siempre, tempo resultados también con SP Global, también buenos resultados. Marriott, 2 hoteles también buenos resultados. Como siempre, ahora sí, vamos a ver cómo están abriendo esas bolsas que están abriendo. Mira, estaba viendo yo el Nasdaq, que mirad, como viene volando el Nasdaq, El Nasdaq de momento viene volando. Fijaos qué pedazo de vela, cómo ha llegado justo a la zona de control. Esta mañana también lo comentábamos, de hecho, vamos con un algo también en la membresía. Ya sabéis que mira, esta mañana ha sido una pedazo de sala también de trading, cogiendo profits, sumando mucho, se paga solo, amigos. Yo no sé, como todavía hay gente que nos ve todos los días y no está, porque es tremendo los resultados que estamos teniendo. Quizás no vaya a ser así siempre, pero resultados muy buenos. Vaya pedazo de vela envolvente estamos viendo en el Nasdaq, que de momento, mirad, nosotros decíamos ayer, joder, estamos justo llegando a la directriz bajista, la que une los máximos decrecientes, que es un nivel importantísimo. ¿Por qué? Porque es una zona de resistencia, lleva siendo la resistencia desde mitad de diciembre, 2 meses ya prácticamente de resistencia, con una directriz bajista que sí, que marca máximos decrecientes. Y justo lo que hacía el precio ayer, cuando llegaba a esa zona, porque yo me acuerdo que cuando terminamos el programa, estaba tanteando, estaba casi acariciando, prácticamente haciendo un masaje a la directriz, y fijaos cómo rebotaba. Es verdad que ese anuncio de Donald Trump ya de, por fin oficial, los aranceles del 25% al aluminio y al acero, hacían que cayera un poco las bolsas, pero fijaos cómo el mercado ya digiere mucho mejor estos comentarios, estas ruedas de prensa de Trump, y cada vez tendrán menos peso, ¿no? Es verdad que en los primeros días, pues claro, bueno, mira, fijaos qué volatilidad, montaña rusa absoluta, alcista, bajista, alcista, bajista, alcista, bajista, pero ya cada vez esos impuestos son un poco más pequeñitos, y vamos a ver si durante la sesión de hoy queremos o no queremos romper esta directriz bajista para ir a atacar, insisto, esos máximos que todavía quedarían un poquito más arriba. Estamos ahora mismo cotizando estos 21.692, pero mirad la pedazo de velas, y vamos a bajar, vamos a ir haciendo el brujuleo, ya sabéis, brujuleo, la contextualización de cada mercado de mayor a menor temporalidad. Por cierto, quedan todavía 12 minutos, 12 sí, para llegar a las 4 de la tarde, hora española, las 3 en Canarias, para cambiar de vela horaria. O sea que hasta que no tengamos el cierre de vela, no sabemos si vamos a tener una vela envolvente o no. Pero de momento sería una vela que envuelve a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, casi 8 velas, 8 horas que estamos envolviendo de momento con esta apertura tan alcista de momento, tras las campanas que hemos escuchado de Wall Street, como siempre en directo. Fijaos los niveles clave. Siempre digo yo la importancia capital, crucial, tremenda, que tiene el ir marcando bien las zonas de control. Era una zona que había sido soporte y que pasó a ser resistencia, pasó a ser soporte, y a partir de ahí el rebote también de mucha enjundia. De hecho, la directriz más acelerada, que podríamos también graficarla, tirarla, dibujarla, sería esta de aquí, ya también la habríamos roto. Esto está con mucha fuerza. De hecho, vamos a ver ahora, creo que es interesante ver un ejercicio. Esta rotura, justo estamos haciendo ahora el pullback, mirar, bueno, quizás mira, 1, 2, qué pena, porque parece que en gráficos muy pequeñitos, pues esto un módulo arranque en 1 en 2, onda impulsiva 3, claro, y dices, joder, ahora está haciendo un posible ABC en 4, ¿no? La verdad que me gustaría a mí que fuera un poco más extenso en precio, sobre todo, para poder entrar, pero mirad cómo este nivel clave ya ha ejercido como zona de soporte, y es verdad que puede parecer una cuarta onda para continuar. Por cierto, para continuar subiendo. Por cierto, en 11 minutos, lo he dicho a las 4 de la tarde, se supone que empieza a hablar Jerome Powell, o sea que estaremos pendientes también para conectar en directo con el presidente de la Reserva Federal. Mirad, cómo está cayendo ahora el Nasdaq, zona de control que, bueno, aquí lo ha dilatado. Fijaos como aquí tenemos unos buenos cierres. ¿Por qué? Porque vemos cómo llega a la zona de control y ¿qué tenemos? Cierres lejos de los mínimos, cierres lejos de los mínimos. Traduzco, entrada de compras, posibilidad también de ver nuevas subidas. Entonces, sí, está la cosa interesante. Yo, vamos, no descarto el poder colocar una orden. Hombre, sería ideal ver un poquito más de corrección. Vamos a colocarlo por aquí a lo mejor en 21.672. Vamos a poner una orden limitada de compra, 21.672, buscando este Elliott. Es verdad que me suele gustar que el 4 sea un poco más extenso en precio en tiempo que el 2. El 2 ya se lo ha hecho bastante, pero fijaos, una A, B, C, D y E, muy claro el módulo de arranque. Ya hemos cogido algún larguito por aquí. Fijaos cómo, mirar, hablando de Elliott, para que nos hagamos una idea, fijaos lo que operábamos hoy en la sesión europea. Ayer sacamos un corto en euro-dólar, hoy hemos cogido un largo en el cable, muy bueno, pero mirar, hemos estado operando una formación muy similar a la que estamos viendo ahora mismo en el Nasdaq, que es un Elliott. Básicamente nosotros ya sabéis que con Elliott operamos mucho. Usamos, bueno, es una parte del sistema, pero esta es la onda 1, la onda 2, la onda 3, lo estoy pintando, como diría nuestro amigo Goyo Martínez, y fijaos como la quinta onda al final ha extendido más de lo que pensábamos, habíamos salido nosotros creo que por aquí, pero qué bonito también este Elliot y cómo están subiendo mucho los pares que cruzan contra el dólar, ¿no? La libra que tiene el dólar de apellido, el cable que sigue subiendo, que sigue marcando, ahí lo veis, nuevas subidas, prácticamente, de hecho mirad, aquí también qué bien se veía. ¿Qué han hecho aquí? Esto es una barrida, esto es una trampa bajista, esto es una maniobra de manipulación. ¿Qué nosotros siempre recordamos y decimos de las barridas? Que son como tesoros, ¿verdad? Esto es una trampa bajista, una mini zona de acumulación y a partir de ahí aparece la demanda y esto va disparado en dirección norte. Y fijaos, hablando un poco de todo esto, hoy estamos viendo cómo está subiendo de momento claro, está subiendo de momento pero el Nasdaq, pero es verdad que el Bitcoin sigue flojo, decía José. Vamos a hablar un poco de criptomonedas. Es que las criptomonedas, madre mía, mirad cómo siguen de laterales. Llevamos ya, bueno, todo el mes de enero, esta primera decena también de febrero, hoy cayendo de momento, no mucho, pero cayendo ligeramente la vela diaria. Estamos en los 97.014 ahora mismo, y fijaos las últimas velas diarias, qué lateral. Sigue por debajo de esta pedazo de línea del bien y del mal del Bitcoin, y hasta que no se coloque por aquí, nosotros decíamos, o que se coloque por encima de esta zona o que baje ya aquí, pero de momento va lateralizando y va dejando pues como un poco esos movimientos tan complicados, tan aburridos realmente, alcista, bajista. Esto parece como digo yo, la congestión de la M30 dirección sur, 6 de la tarde en Madrid. Los que son madrileños me entenderán a tremendos atascos que se forman, y claro, aquí ahora mismo es imposible plantear escenarios, hay que esperar a que salga de este tremendo aburrimiento, pero yo os lo prometía, decía, tenemos una métrica muy alcista para el Bitcoin, no tan a corto plazo, no para la sesión de hoy, pero os va a gustar, tenemos una métrica que es tremenda, y además os va a dejar, yo creo que os va a dejar la boca abierta. ¿Dónde lo vas a ver? Como siempre en el plató, en las criptotendencias. Esperaros que esto de verdad os va a gustar y os va a interesar. Vamos a las criptotendencias, vamos al plató.
Todas las noticias y la actualidad del sector. Análisis, información e inversión. Todo en Crypto Trend.
El mundo de las criptomonedas, Bitcoin y las altcoins sigue muy lateral, sigue bastante aburrido, quizás pendiente del dato del IPC de mañana y donde podremos ver movimiento, quizás pendiente también de la rueda de prensa, que empieza en nada, de Jerome Powell, donde estaremos conectando en directo con el presidente de la Reserva Federal. Pues estaremos pendientes. De momento sigue Bitcoin por abajo de los 100.000, le está costando, he recuperado otra vez los 100.000, tampoco es que esté cayendo mucho, sigue mareando en esa gran zona que nosotros pensamos que es una gran zona de reacumulación, es decir, una consolidación para continuar con la tendencia alcista. Nos estáis preguntando muchos qué pasa con Ethereum, qué pasa con Solana, qué pasa con Cardano. Por cierto, ayer Grayscale presentaba la solicitud para el ETF al contado de Cardano y la primera reacción que tenía el mercado de ADA, su token, era subir rápidamente. Por cierto, aquí tenemos el consultorio, si nos queréis preguntar sobre Cardano, sobre Avalanche, nos preguntáis también mucho sobre algunos tokens, algunas meme coins que a mí no me gustan personalmente, pero en cualquier caso nos podéis escribir al consultorio que salía en pantalla y os resolvemos cualquier duda de criptomonedas, también sobre Chain, sobre KIC, cómo guardar en las wallets frías. Todo eso es un servicio gratuito que tenemos de cara a todos vosotros, a los iba a decir televidentes, YouTube evidentes, ¿verdad? Que tenemos aquí, como siempre, en TradingPRO. Dicho esto, tenemos unas gráficas métricas de Bitcoin, de por qué son métricas alcistas, que os van a encantar. Como siempre, en este Crypto Trends, en este espacio dedicado al sector de las criptomonedas, traemos unas imágenes que nos ayudan a entender cuál es la salud del sector. De momento en Bitcoin parece buena, sí, llevamos un tiempo aburrido y yo sé que cansa, este lateral cansa, pero mirad lo que os traemos. Primera imagen, la estamos viendo ya en pantalla. ¿Qué significa esto? Vamos a ponerlo en grande para explicar por qué es cuanto menos interesante, vais a ver, mirad, ahora mismo, esto es histórico, ahora mismo quedan solo 140.000 bitcoins en los mercados OTC, los over the counter, venga. Es decir, si MicroStrategy, o realmente Estrategia, que se ve a cambiar el nombre, realiza 3 compras más al ritmo que va comprando, se agotarán todos los bitcoin OTC. Si los ETFs acumulan tanto como en enero, se agotarán los Bitcoin OTC. Esto es tremendo, que se agoten, ¿no? Si Estados Unidos y los 15 estados que tienen ya las enmiendas comienzan a comprar Bitcoins, ya se entiende la idea, ¿no? Es decir, que casi no quedan Bitcoins ni siquiera para los institucionales. Se están agotando los Bitcoins. Hemos visto, vamos a ver también un gráfico cómo se estaban agotando también las reservas de los exchanges, cómo también en los mercados OTC se están acabando. Esto es tremendo, ¿eh? La demanda sigue siendo fuerte, los ETF siguen teniendo buenos números, las instituciones siguen comprando. Compraba de hecho justo ayer Strategy, perdón, hay que llamarlo con su nuevo nombre, Strategy B, también compraba Metaplanet, otra empresa japonesa también compraba 6 millones en Bitcoin. Es decir, las empresas siguen acumulando Bitcoin, los estados ya veremos si empiezan a comprar también Bitcoin, El Salvador también sigue acumulando, pero cada vez la oferta es menor, tanto en los exchanges como en los OTC, ¿eh? Y esto ya sabemos, cuando estos desequilibrios entre demanda y oferta, lo que suele pasar. Pero correlacionado con esta imagen, vamos a ver la siguiente que tenemos para hoy, porque va un poco con la misma idea. La escasez tremenda de Bitcoin que tenemos, ¿eh? Aquí lo vais a ver, vamos a poner también esta gráfica en grande para ver lo que está pasando y lo que muestra. Fijaos, este es tremendo. Aquí tenemos el Bitcoin, el total OTC también desbalance, lo estáis viendo, el saldo de mesa OTC está disminuyendo bruscamente. En septiembre de 2021 el saldo de la mesa, fijaos, en septiembre de 2021 era de 480.000 y hoy se sitúan esos 140.000, tremendo. Fijaos la gráfica, ahí lo estáis viendo, la gráfica que está marcada en azul, la blanca es el precio y el azul son el total OTC, el balance de OTC. Fijaos cómo va la tendencia claramente bajista, cómo se está agotando de una forma salvaje. Es tremendo esto. Y es que si vosotros buscáis también la gráfica de los exchanges que hay en los balances, en los intercambios, es lo mismo, ¿eh? En Coinbase, en Binance, en Kraken, etcétera, vais a ver que la tendencia es igual, que se están agotando los bitcoins. Cuidadín que estos son a priori, no a corto plazo obviamente, pero a medio y largo plazo, son métricas muy alcistas para el Bitcoin, que siempre nos gusta a nosotros separar Bitcoin de criptomonedas. El Bitcoin es casi una apuesta segura, mientras el resto de las criptos no lo son tanto. Muchas de ellas, de hecho, yo siempre lo he dicho, hay millones de criptomonedas, la gran mayoría de esas, el 97% de ellas tenderán a cero, no valdrán nada en el futuro, ¿eh? Aquí las redes sociales, @TradingPRO Media, nos podéis seguir en todas ellas. Compartimos, como siempre, información a diario. Vamos con la tercera imagen que os traemos para hoy, después de ver estas dos primeras tremendas, ¿eh? Vamos a seguir hablando un poquito de Bitcoin, el rey, el king, que aquí tenemos, fondo blanco, lo vamos a poner también en grande para que lo podáis apreciar mejor desde vuestros dispositivos y ver qué significa esto. Mirad, por cierto, hablando de Bitcoin, decíamos, joder, estas son métricas alcistas a largo plazo. Pues mira, las ballenas que piensan, lo saben yo creo, y han movido ya más de 60.000 Bitcoins en la última semana. Los están moviendo, de exchange a sus carteras. Esto es, bueno, siguen acumulando, Fijaos los movimientos de la última semana, esa tendencia alcista, ¿verdad? Movimientos de las ballenas, o sea que también gráfica, esto también lo estamos viendo, esta tónica, por cierto, también en Ethereum, estamos viendo cómo las ballenas siguen acumulando. Al final, lo estamos viendo, lo he dicho ayer, que compraba Sailor, que compraba Bukele, que compraba Metaplanet, es decir, siguen confiando en que estamos en una reacumulación. Es decir, si los grandes, los que tienen información, los que suelen tener también más formación, están comprando, están acumulando, ¿por qué vamos a vendérselo nosotros? También está comprando Larry Fink con BlackRock, es decir, vamos a seguir pensando que estamos en una reacumulación. Desde luego nosotros en TradingPRO tenemos bastante claro nuestro escenario y por eso operamos a ello, y nosotros también seguimos viendo un Bitcoin alcista. Vamos con la cuarta imagen que tenemos para hoy, después de las tres primeras métricas que en principio hablan de una buena salud del Bitcoin. Otra vez fondo blanco, también se ve mejor seguramente si lo pongamos en grande, por lo tanto vamos a explicar también qué se trata de qué se trata, fijaos, de esta gráfica. Este es el Bitcoin, con las líneas de la ley de la potencia. No sé si habéis visto alguna vez este gráfico, si no os lo presentamos porque es interesantísimo, Ahí lo veis, el Bitcoin long term, largo tiempo, de la Power Law Analysis, la ley de la potencia. Es cierto que cada ciclo, las líneas de la potencia suelen ser, o sea, cada ciclo son más pequeños, ¿no? Cada ciclo da menos rentabilidad, da menos impulso y es normal, Este ciclo no va a llegar a las líneas de los ciclos anteriores ni de broma. Pero fijaos cómo se está peleando de una forma muy dura con esa línea, lo vemos, la flecha en naranja, ya había sido el máximo justo antes, fijaos, lo veis como había sido el máximo justo antes en la anterior gran reacumulación y vuelve otra vez a ser este máximo. Tiene que ser capaz de romperla para ir al siguiente nivel, a la siguiente línea. Funcionan de maravilla estas líneas, es una auténtica maravilla y lo tenéis al lado. ¿Qué líneas son? Las Power Law por 1, Power Law por 1,5, Power Law por 2, ahí lo tenéis. Es tremendo este gráfico, es brutal este gráfico y como mientras no rompa esto va a ser complicado ir al siguiente nivel. Tiene que romper ese nivel, ya veremos, si hace una reacumulación cada vez la línea va siendo más alta y la puede tocar, ¿no? Pero veremos si este ciclo quiere ir a la siguiente línea o no, está por ver. Yo creo que podemos hacerlo, pero depende de muchos. Necesitamos catalizadores positivos, de momento estamos exentos, ¿no? Esperábamos que esa reserva estratégica de Bitcoin de Donald Trump bolsa viniera quizás subir noticias antes. De momento parece que está la cosa muy parada. Vamos a ver también si la Reserva Federal baja tipos antes o no, porque a falta de catalizadores positivos es complicado que rompamos este lateral. Vamos con la última imagen que os traemos para hoy. Y claro, viendo que Bitcoin sí parece en una salud más o menos decente, ¿qué pasa con el resto de las criptomonedas? Pues no tanto, las altcoins, las alternative coins, no tanto. Vamos a ponerlo en grande para ver. Fijaos que esperábamos todos que desde que ganara Donald Trump esto iba a ser una fiesta tremenda, las criptomonedas iban a subir todas. Nada de eso, De hecho, mirad, es un dato terrible, Casi el 70% de las criptomonedas cotizan ahora por debajo de lo que lo hacían antes de las elecciones estadounidenses. Es decir, de todas las criptomonedas, el 70% están ahora más bajas, o sea, desde que ha llegado Donald Trump, están más bajas ahora que antes de que llegara Donald Trump. No se ha venido bien la presidencia de Donald Trump a las mayorías. A Bitcoin sí, Bitcoin está por encima, lógicamente, subió mucho según salió Donald Trump presidente, pero el 70% de las criptomonedas, nada de eso, están por debajo de lo que era Donald Trump. No sé si es culpa de Donald Trump o no. Yo insisto que hay demasiados proyectos y el dinero se diluye entre tanto proyecto. Si hubieran muchos menos proyectos sería mucho mejor para el sector. Al haber tantos se diluye el dinero y es muy complicado que ese dinero fluya hacia Ethereum, Cardano, Avalanche, porque sale una criptomoneda de Donald Trump y agarra mucha liquidez, sale una criptomoneda de Melania, agarra mucha liquidez y así con todos los proyectos que no valen absolutamente nada. Mientras siga habiendo tanto proyecto es complicado que las otras altcoins suban. Vamos a ver si se va haciendo una limpieza del mercado, se va reduciendo y volvemos a las criptomonedas de utilidad. De momento Bitcoin se salva, Bitcoin sigue a lo suyo, lo estamos demostrando con las gráficas de hoy, o sea que nada, tranquilidad y paciencia, como siempre decimos que es la madre de la ciencia. Está a punto de empezar Powell, vamos otra vez como siempre al set, de la mano de José Osagoiti, vamos allá.
Todas las noticias y la actualidad del sector. Análisis, información e inversión. Todo en Crypto Trend.
Cuatro en punto de la tarde, 4 en punto de la tarde, ahora iremos con Powell. De momento viene la bolsa subiendo, estáis hablando muchos de Alibaba. Ahora lo comentaremos, estaba de hecho poniéndolo justo en el grupo de Telegram. Que bueno, otro gran día para Alibaba y la acción ha subido ya pues ayer un 7% y casi un 40% en el último mes. Sabéis que es la posición más fuerte que tenemos en TradingPRO, así como la posición más fuerte de Michael Barry o David Tepper en sus portfolios. Vamos un poco de la mano esos grandes analistas y la verdad es que nos está yendo fantásticamente bien. Aquí lo hemos repetido muchísimas veces y me alegro a los que hayáis tenido paciencia. Ya decíamos que era una posición de medio largo plazo, no una posición de corto plazo, y por fin está empezando a dar sus resultados. Nosotros mantenemos, ahora repasaremos por supuesto la estrategia, la tesis de inversión, pero bueno, está empezando a dispararse de una manera tremenda. Hay que, como digo, también ser paciente con los resultados. Vamos a compartir pantalla antes de ir con Powell, porque quiero hacer ese repaso de posiciones también, por supuesto. Hemos comentado que estábamos largos en Nasdaq y lo vamos a poner. Hemos entrado aquí ya con 0,02 lotes, aquí lo veis. Fijaros, cómo tenemos impulso A, B y C. Y esperamos un segundo impulso, ¿verdad? Proporcional al primero, es verdad que estamos ahora atacando la directriz bajista, pero esperamos este movimiento a lo largo de la sesión de hoy. Estamos ya largos, está ya corriendo en positivo. También estamos largos en la membresía, por cierto, todos los que estáis dados alta en este servicio, este programa educativo, ¿verdad? Esta docencia que tenemos en TradingPRO. Bueno, ya disfrutando de este viaje, vamos a ver si puede romper este nivel, como digo, de resistencia. Si Powell, evidentemente, no es muy hawkish, posiblemente ayude, ¿no?, a la rotura. Y como siempre, el stop loss situado por debajo de la zona de FIBO con cierto oxígeno. Aquí tenemos un ratio pues prácticamente de 1 a 1, algo mayor. Y bueno, pues buscando entornos, el profit en los niveles de los 21.950 puntos. Bien, así que bueno, así está la posición del Nasdaq que hemos abierto esta mañana, la queremos actualizar. Cuenta real, la cuenta 115.890. Somos, ya sabéis, de los poquitos espacios que operamos en directo y en real, ¿verdad? Lo hacemos con buenas corporativas, por cierto, cuentas siempre auditadas, ¿verdad? Las que tenemos, que podéis seguir a través de la plataforma MQL5, esta cuenta, ¿verdad?, que abrimos en septiembre, ya con más de un 30% de rentabilidad. Vamos a ver qué tal va esta posición, insisto, en el Nasdaq. La iremos actualizando a lo largo de la sesión. Y bueno, preguntáis también por Baba, quería comentarlo, poquito aquí. Este es el grupo de Telegram que tenemos, la comunidad oficial de TradingPRO. Aquí estaba comentando, ¿verdad? Un poco, pues este pequeño chascarrillo de Baba, lo que está haciendo y cómo nosotros vamos de la mano de Michael Barry, David Tepper. Ayer anunció Tepper, por cierto, su portfolio. Sigue muy invertido en China. También, por cierto, el KBEP, el ETF KBEP, subiendo como la espuma, está yendo francamente bien. Por cierto, ya sabéis que todos estos movimientos los podéis ver en el apartado de Super Investors, en TradingPRO, ¿verdad? Aquí lo tenéis, en Super Investor. Podéis ver todos los movimientos de David Tepper, de Michael Barry, de Warren Buffett, de todos los que queráis. Los podéis ver de forma gratuita, además, ¿no? Un poco los movimientos trimestrales que van haciendo, ¿verdad? Bill Gates, Bill Ackman, ayer hablaba Álvaro de esa compra de Uber, de Bill Ackman. Bueno, os podéis aquí seguir en TradingPRO. El programa de membresía es que lo tenéis aquí, en formación membresía, ahí lo podéis seguir. Pero quería ver Baba, está ya comentándome el productor del programa, que ahora comentaremos con Powell, pero fijaros qué gráfico tan interesante, ¿no? Hoy se anunciaba pues ese acuerdo con Apple, de Alibaba, ya sabéis que había previamente anunciado su inteligencia artificial. A priori los chinos, no solo DeepSeek, sino Alibaba, entrenando, desarrollando esa capacidad cognitiva de las inteligencias artificiales con mucho menor coste, ¿verdad?, que OpenAI en este caso, aunque se aprovecharon evidentemente el código abierto. Esto cada vez es más escalable, pues es mucho más normal que se vayan llegando a mismos resultados con menor costes, algo totalmente normal en cualquier carrera o en cualquier batalla, ¿verdad?, como es la inteligencia artificial. Y bueno, Alibaba, bueno, que para mí es una acción que está a múltiplos de risa, es una joya, un caramelo que dentro de 5 años diremos, lo hemos podido comprar en 70, 80 y un lujo. Nosotros tenemos el primer gran objetivo en los 170. Esto es una fase de acumulación por Wyckoff. Los que os sepáis, estamos ahora mismo atacando de nuevo la clavicular, una zona de fuerte volumen, de VPOC, donde entró mucho papel en el pasado. Fijaos los pivotajes que dejaba el precio. También la última vez, aquí recordad que anunció China estímulos monetarios por parte del Banco Popular, también estímulos fiscales, aunque no fueron del todo esperados por los inversores. Se esperaba quizá estímulos más agresivos. Tuvo esta corrección, ya marcó mínimo creciente y volvemos a atacar esa zona de resistencia. Nosotros vamos muy posicionados. De hecho, en nuestra cartera de inversión, Alibaba es el valor que más peso tiene, pero vamos de largo. Aparte también estamos expuestos en el FXI, en el KBEP, dos ETFs dos ETFs que invierten en el mercado chino, uno de large cap, otro de grandes tecnológicas. Y cuando rompa esta resistencia, hablamos en el ADR, en dólares, Alibaba, cuando rompa los 117, buscaremos más compras todavía. Para mí es una de las grandes joyas, como digo. No quiero sesgar ni mucho menos la opinión de nadie. Aquí no somos asesores, no damos consejos de inversión, simplemente comparto. Yo soy transparente, ¿no? Comparto mi visión de mercado, pero la rotura creo que nos dará otra opción de añadir muy importante con este gran objetivo, insisto, en los 170, lo repito, dólares. Como siempre comentamos, una fase de acumulación o distribución, una fase de Wyckoff confirmada, que sería con la rotura de esta clavicular, viene a deshacer el último impulso previo. Por lo tanto, insisto, tendría un imán, una zona de objetivo, creo que muy clara, de alta probabilidad en estos entornos. No, es verdad que China tiene riesgos, como siempre comentamos, que el gobierno comunista pues vente expropie o que haga o que es muy opaco, puede pasar lo que sea, pero desde luego a nivel de ventas, a nivel de ingresos y a nivel de potencial, y por supuesto del lado técnico, pues una empresa que a mí personalmente me encanta, ¿no? Pero como todo tiene riesgos, esto no lo vamos a negar, ¿no? Así que, bueno, ahora iremos, pero bueno, pues quería analizar rápidamente, muy rápidamente los diferentes mercados. Comentábamos el oro ayer hablábamos de que era muy normal llegar a este nivel, al P62, fijaros cómo fue llegar el oro y aquí corregir. Es que vamos, esto es Sistema TradingPRO, nos llevamos aquí de forma diaria, estamos de lunes a jueves en directo de 3:30 a 5 hora española. Ayer estábamos en este punto y decíamos, es que hay yo decía, ayer lo comenté, está grabado, decía, una zona, o sea, muy probable que el precio toque estos niveles, los 2.930 dólares. Muy probable. Estamos cotizando en los entornos de los 2.900 y teníamos 30 dólares de subida. Yo dije, no me gusta hablar de certezas porque tú das la mano y la gente te coge el brazo por lo general, entonces vamos a ser siempre correctos a la hora de utilizar retórica, a la hora de hablar. En el mundo del trading no hay certezas, no tenemos la bola de cristal, esto no es un tarot bursátil, para nada. Siempre trabajamos con probabilidades. El trabajo de un trade es un trabajo estadístico, es buscar siempre una esperanza matemática positiva a lo largo del tiempo y siempre hablamos de probabilidades. Pero yo decía que esta es una zona de altísima probabilidad. Cuando digo altísima probabilidad me refiero más de un 70%. Nosotros tenemos un sistema muy testeado, un track record importante donde medimos esos patrones, ¿no? Y fijaos cómo fue tocado, y esto evidentemente tanto lo pasado se dice hoy, pero bueno, ayer lo estábamos comentando en directo. Vamos a ver qué análisis tenemos de cara al futuro, que es lo interesante, ¿no? Pues ahora, como siempre, hemos llegado a la zona de semáforo en rojo y esperamos la siguiente, la zona de semáforo, semáforo naranja a semáforo en rojo, ¿no? La zona de armonía dentro de estos impulsos. ¿Cuánto que esperamos ahora? Lo de siempre, el A, el B y el C. ¿Para qué? Para buscar de nuevo el lado largo en este bull run que está haciendo el oro. En una corrección ABC, veremos si ABC o ABCDE, pero desde luego la haremos generando. ¿Para qué? Para buscar el siguiente objetivo, el siguiente nivel lo tenemos ya pues muy cerca de los 3.000, los entornos de los 2.990. Esto para cartera de trading. Sabéis que nosotros también en cartera de inversión mantenemos exposición al oro a través de ETFs. Ayer me escribisteis muchos por el consultorio y os mandé el ETF en el que estamos invertidos, de iShares, ¿verdad? Siempre ETFs físicos, no sintéticos, ¿verdad? Bueno, aquí es un poco lo que esperamos de cara al oro en próximas horas, ¿no? Esto es una PSC en la zona del semáforo naranja, hace la A, esperamos una B y una C para ya subirnos de nuevo un lado largo y buscar la zona del P100 o zona de armonía. A ver si me comenta por aquí el señor W, el productor, si tenemos ya Powell y conectamos con él o aún no tenemos conexión. No. Vamos a ver si me lo comentan por aquí, si tenemos... No lo tenemos aún. Creo que no tenemos a Powell. Vale, ahora conectamos con él. Vamos a seguir con el repaso, ahora vamos con él. DAX, máximos históricos, vamos a hacer el repaso del tablero rápido. Y ahora, como digo, vamos con Powell, a punto de tener ya conexión con él. Fijaros, está haciendo esta cuña terminal, el DAX está muy fuerte. Mucha gente me habla de esa desconexión entre la economía real y la economía financiera, cómo es que el DAX marca máximos y máximos y máximos y Alemania va tan mal, ¿no? Bueno, como siempre decimos, el DAX es un índice global, no es un índice alemán. A día de hoy las empresas que forman, las 40 empresas que forman parte del DAX operan en todo el mundo, por lo tanto ya no es un termómetro, ¿no?, de la economía real. Y además las bolsas ya, como digo, no representan la economía de un país, son termómetros de liquidez, ¿no? Si hay liquidez subirán, aunque la economía vaya mal, siempre digo lo mismo, ¿no? Bueno, de momento no vamos a buscar el lado largo y vamos a ver si nos confirma la rotura a la baja para empezar a buscar el lado corto en el DAX, Esto es ya por ratios riesgo-beneficio. El lado largo creo que no es atractivo, lleva ya un 7% de subida, un poquito más el DAX. Sabéis que por lo general en términos nominales un índice como el DAX o el SP500 suele generar históricamente un 7% de rentabilidad al año. Pues el DAX a 11 de febrero ya lleva esa rentabilidad, bueno, pues ya muy sobrecomprado, ¿no? Ya un atracador importante. Como digo, la tendencia es alcista, no vamos a buscar de momento el lado corto, pero si confirma la rotura de esta cuña con fuerza y por tanto la fase de agotamiento, la pauta de agotamiento, siempre vamos a buscar el lado corto. Desde luego vamos a mirar siempre el lado corto, no el lado largo. Pero siempre y cuando confirme la pauta, cosa que aún no ha hecho, sigue marcando máximos históricos y alineado de momento con las subidas que tenemos en el Nasdaq. Nasdaq ya estamos largos, por cierto, a punto de romper la directriz. Por cierto, también estamos buscando el lado largo en SP500. Esto es el SP500, gráfico de 30 minutos. Si perfora, si rompe esta directriz de corto plazo. Bueno, ahora sí, creo que tenemos ya al presidente de la Reserva Federal hablando ante el Senado de los Estados Unidos, así que vamos a escucharle, vamos a ver qué tiene que decir. Está contestando ya preguntas de los senadores y bueno, luego conectaremos de nuevo para ver la volatilidad que está generando y analizar un poco las palabras del presidente de la Banca Central estadounidense. Vamos con Powell.
After President Trump was elected, within the space of just a few weeks, you scrubbed seemingly all mention of diversity and inclusion from the Fed's website. You withdrew from an international central bank group that shares information on climate-related risks to the financial system. You instituted a hiring freeze that will limit the number of cops on the Wall Street beat, and you announced plans to gut big bank stress tests. I can see the immediate political appeal of your strategy, but ultimately it will fail. You will lose good people. Climate catastrophes will continue to mount, and the increasing vulnerability of big banks will threaten our entire economy. Sure, Donald Trump may be happier with you right now, but wading deeper into politics to please him over the long run will burn the reputation and the independence of the Fed and put our entire economy at risk. I urge you, don't fall into these traps. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am. Today we'll hear from Chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, on the semi-annual monetary policy report to Congress. Chair Powell, thank you for your testimony today, and you are now recognized.
Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Warren, and other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. The Federal Reserve remains squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. The economy is strong overall and has made significant progress toward our goals over the past 2 years. Labor market conditions have cooled from their formerly overheated state and remain solid. Inflation has moved much closer to our 2% longer-run goal, though it remains somewhat elevated. We are attentive to the risks on both sides of our mandate. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has continued to expand at a solid pace. GDP rose 2.5% in 2024, bolstered by resilient consumer spending. Investment in equipment and intangibles appears to have declined in the fourth quarter, but was solid for the year overall. Following weakness in the middle of last year, activity in the housing sector seems to have stabilized. In the labor market, conditions remain solid and appear to have stabilized. Payroll job gains averaged 189,000 per month over the past 4 months. Following earlier increases, the unemployment rate has been steady now since the middle of last year, and at 4% in January remains low. Nominal wage growth has eased over the past year, and the jobs-to-workers gap has narrowed. Overall, a wide set of indicators suggests that conditions in the labor market are broadly in balance. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. The strong labor market conditions in recent years have helped narrow long-standing disparities in employment and earnings across demographic groups. Inflation has eased significantly over the past 2 years, but remains somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer-term goal. PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in December, and excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.8%. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. Since last September, the FOMC lowered the policy rate by a full percentage point from its peak, after having maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25% to 5.5% for 14 months. That recalibration of our policy stance was appropriate in light of the progress on inflation and the cooling in the labor market. Meanwhile, we have continued to reduce our securities holdings. With our policy stance now significantly less restrictive than it had been, and the economy remaining strong, we do not need to be in a hurry to adjust our policy stance. We know that reducing policy restraint too fast or too much could hinder progress on inflation. At the same time, reducing policy restraint too slowly or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering the extent and timing of additional adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the FOMC will assess incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. As the economy evolves, we will adjust our policy stance in a manner that best promotes our maximum employment and price stability goals. If the economy remains strong and inflation does not continue to move sustainably toward 2%, we can maintain policy restraint for longer. If the labor market were to weaken unexpectedly or inflation were to fall more quickly than anticipated, we can ease policy accordingly. We are attentive to the risks on both sides of our dual mandate, and policy is well positioned to deal with the risks and uncertainties that we face. This year, we are conducting the second periodic review of our monetary policy strategy, tools, and communications, the framework used to pursue our congressionally mandated assigned goals of maximum employment and stable prices. The focus of this review is on the FOMC's Statement on Longer-Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy, which articulates the committee's approach to monetary policy, and on the committee's policy communication tools. The committee's 2% longer-run inflation goal will be retained and will not be a focus of the review. Our review will include outreach and public events involving a wide range of parties, including Fed Listens events around the country and a research conference in May. We will take on board lessons of the past 5 years and adapt our approach where appropriate to best serve the American people to whom we are accountable. We intend to wrap up the review by late summer. Let me conclude by emphasizing that at the Fed, we'll do everything we can to achieve our dual mandate goals that Congress has set for monetary policy. We remain committed to supporting maximum employment, bringing inflation sustainably to our 2% goal, and keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our success in delivering on these goals matters to all Americans. We understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Certainly your words and your actions have a global impact. You have the opportunity and responsibility of leading this country in the right direction economically, and I thank you for your commitment to having a conversation with all of us about how you do that well. You and I had a conversation yesterday. Some of it was frustrating, some of it was illuminating, but in the end, my goal is to make sure that the American people, and specifically those working paycheck to paycheck, have more opportunities to succeed, not fewer. You have said that the Fed is not against innovation, and banks are perfectly able to serve crypto customers as long as they understand and can manage the risks. Yet you have admitted that the threshold has been a little higher for banks engaging in crypto activities. Last week, I held a hearing on debanking and once again heard that federal banking agencies, in particular the Fed, use reputational risk as a tool to encourage the debanking of certain legal industries and law-abiding citizens for political reasons not tied to safety and soundness. Debanking is a top priority for this committee, and it certainly is for me, and one that I believe is a bipartisan issue. Will you commit to working with this committee to end debanking, including working with the new Vice Chair of Supervision, once appointed, to revise the Federal Reserve supervision manuals to remove reputational risk as a tool to weigh in on political topics?
I'm happy to make that commitment.
Thank you, sir. Accountability is very important. I would like to think accountability is a priority for everyone, especially the Fed, given that failures in Fed supervision can result in the loss of billions of dollars. Yet following the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank, which was in part due to the failures of its regulators to identify egregious mismanagement of interest rate and liquidity risks, we have yet to see any regulators be held accountable. And as you recall, that was a point of my frustration. As a guy who spent a lot of time in the private sector, 15 years running a few businesses, I can tell you that accountability is a necessary part of making the entire organization healthier and perform its job as well as possible. I'm encouraged that the FDIC has begun the process of holding SVB executives accountable. That's good news. But no Fed employee has been fired, put on probation, put on performance improvement plan, all of which would be expected in the private sector, as I just mentioned, for employee failure. Please explain to me why Fed employees are held to a different standard from my perspective than everyone else, and what are you planning to do to take accountability?
Bueno, ahí estábamos escuchando al presidente de la Reserva Federal, justo esas últimas preguntas donde ya le estaban también mencionando el tema de las criptomonedas, que últimamente es un tema que no falta en ninguna rueda de prensa de Powell. Ya lo mencionó en su primera rueda de prensa tras la toma de presidencia de Donald Trump. Ha cambiado el discurso de la Reserva Federal en torno al Bitcoin. Titulares, muy rapidito, porque estamos escuchando a Powell. Las bolsas de momento están todavía alcistas, se están tomando con calma. Dice que no es necesario apresurarse a bajar el tipo de interés, que la inflación siga aumentando, eso es verdad, y que podemos suavizar la política si el mercado laboral se debilita inesperadamente o la inflación disminuye más rápido de lo esperado. Vamos a ver aquí también los aranceles, qué impacto tienen a corto plazo. Dice que la economía estadounidense sigue siendo una economía muy fuerte y que el mercado laboral no es una fuente de presiones, ahora mismo que no es una fuente de presiones inflacionarias. Por lo tanto, el resumen para Powell, la inflación todavía sigue siendo alta, además podemos tener, quién sabe, en las siguientes lecturas ciertos repuntes. Recordamos que mañana miércoles a las 2:30 de la tarde española conoceremos el dato de IPC en Estados Unidos, o sea que mañana por la tarde también, con Powell también en directo, tenemos un programón tremendo. Y dice que no hay prisa por recortar las tasas, que la política sigue siendo menos restrictiva y que el mercado laboral es sólido con esos 189.000 empleos en promedio en 4 meses. 189.000 empleos de promedio en 4 meses. Ahí está Powell, de momento manteniendo la calma, no muy hawkish, tampoco muy dovish. De momento las bolsas tomándoselo bien. Recuerda que nosotros estamos operando en directo estos largos en el Nasdaq. Si os parece, vamos a seguir escuchando a ver qué tiene que decir el presidente de la Reserva Federal, Jerome Powell.
Of the regulatory framework around them isn't just harsh, it's oppressive. Larger banks suggest that the cost per employee for the regulatory framework is $10,000 per employee. I think we can do better and would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right, first of all, I will commit to working with you on that. We do try to avoid excessive burden. I think it's fair to take a fresh look on, frankly, on debanking. I think we all see, both in your hearing and in the one on the House side, we hear a lot of people talking about that. And, it's time to take a fresh look, I think. We don't intentionally do these things, but sometimes regulation leads things to happen, and we need to be working on that.
I appreciate that, and I'll turn it over to the ranking member. I'll say this, after having a number of conversations with CEOs of banks around the country, one of the things that was made clear to me was specific statement from the CEOs is that the regulatory OCC and other regulatory agencies said specifically to debank certain industries, and that is the point that I'm making and one that I think we have to solve. If it's legal in America to do business, we should do our part to make sure that they're banked.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So over the weekend, Co-President Musk and Acting Director Vogt effectively shut down the CFPB. No more cop on the beat looking out for a family of 4 in South Carolina facing an illegal foreclosure. No more cop on the beat looking out for your grandma whose bank account has just been taken over by a scammer. No more cop on the beat looking out for people getting ripped off by giant credit card companies that are charging illegal junk fees. It also means that the CFPB is no longer doing one of its most important jobs, examining big banks to root out illegal conduct before it happens, or at least stop it before more people get hurt. Chair Powell, if the CFPB isn't on the job right now, then who is administering JP Morgan or Wells Fargo's consumer compliance exams to ensure that they are following the law?
Senator, I believe that, and you would know, that Dodd-Frank moved all authority for examinations in the consumer space to the CFPB. We still have some jurisdiction.
We'll talk about that in a sec, but the answer to my question, please. If the CFPB is not there examining these giant banks to make sure they are following the laws on not cheating consumers, who is doing that job?
I can say no other federal regulator.
No one, in other words. So thanks to Co-President Musk and CFPB Acting Director Vogt, Wall Street banks no longer have to show the bank examiners that they're not illegally opening accounts people didn't ask for, like happened with Wells Fargo, or charging illegal junk fees like the Bank of America did. But CFPB has jurisdiction only on banks that have more than $10 billion in assets. So what's happening in thousands of community banks all around the country, those that have less than $10 billion in assets? So Chair Powell, as you know, the Fed oversees consumer compliance for state member banks that have less than $10 billion in assets. Has the Fed suspended consumer compliance exams for those smaller banks, or is the Fed still on the job to make sure that those smaller banks are following consumer financial laws?
Still on the job, business as usual.
All right. By forcing the CFPB not to do its job, President Trump, Elon Musk, and the author of Project 2025, Russ Vought, are giving Wall Street banks an unlimited get-out-of-jail-free card so they can cheat working families, even while community banks continue to play by the rules. You know, for any Americans who have money deposited at JP Morgan or Wells Fargo or any other of the giant banks, they should now know that there is no one on the job to make sure that those banks are not scamming you. Only the smaller banks now have a cop on the beat to make sure that they aren't cheating consumers. You know, if I have my money in one of those giant banks, I might think about going to a smaller bank where the protection, at least right now, is a whole lot better. Now, at the same time that the CFPB is under attack, the Fed is buckling to pressure from Wall Street to erase other safeguards for the too big to fail banks. During the first Trump administration, under your leadership, the Fed weakened the big bank stress tests, including by giving the big banks some of the answers to the test in advance. I called you out on it, but you promised right here in this committee that you would not give those banks the whole answer key. I'm going to quote you back. You said, complete knowledge of the models could lead to a model monoculture in which all firms have similar internal stress testing models, which could increase the correlation of risk in the system and miss key idiosyncratic risks faced by the firms. I agreed with you. But several weeks ago, the Fed announced that it has plans to do exactly that, hand all of the answers over to the giant banks. Chair Powell, why is the Fed about to propose a rule that directly contradicts your own testimony and, in your own words, would render the stress tests toothless?
Senator, in essence, because the ground has shifted very substantially in administrative law, and we actually want the stress test to remain resilient to that. And so we're making changes to accomplish that.
Well, the changes are changes you've identified earlier as making those tests toothless. Look, the big banks are going to juice shareholder payouts and leave this economy more vulnerable to a crash. The Fed is knuckling under to bank lobbyists. We know how this ends. People will suffer. Wall Street will get bailed out. I urge you, Chair Powell, to serve Main Street instead of Wall Street. Don't weaken these rules.
Thank you. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming before the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. I've got a series of questions, but I would like to give you an opportunity, if you would like. The suggestion that the ranking member has made here is that the big banks can now scam individuals right now. Any change in the laws regarding how they're supposed to be treating the individual consumers out there or anything along that line?
Law changes? No, I'm not aware of any
changes, any rules that they would have to follow?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are they still audited, and do they still have the regulators in watching all of their businesses just as they did before?
Well, they'd have all the regulators except for the CFPB.
Very good.
If in fact, in the hypothetical, the CFPB weren't carrying that out.
Anything else you'd like to add before we move on?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we continue to prioritize the stability and the resilience of our financial system, the ongoing Basel III rulemaking process has remained front and center in shaping our regulatory framework. I guess I was rather outspoken with my opposition to the original proposal, and further work was stalled at the end of the last year. I guess my question for you today, sir, is could you provide an update on the Federal Reserve's progress in finalizing the Basel III endgame rulemaking process?
I'd be glad to. So we remain committed to completing Basel III Endgame. We think it's good for U.S. banks, it's good for our economy that there be a global standard beneath which foreign banks can't fall. And that was one of the big ideas behind the whole Basel Committee approach. So where it sits now is we await leadership arriving at the OCC and the FDIC, and that seems to be happening. And when that happens, we're going to sit down with them and work our way through to a Basel III Endgame proposal. And I think we can do this reasonably quickly, one that is compliant, consistent with the Basel requirements, and also consistent with what other large jurisdictions are doing. I'm optimistic that we can do that fairly quickly, and we're committed to doing that.
We always wanted our banks to be competitive with European banks. And I'm just curious, the original proposal that was in front of you, and I'd like your thoughts on this, it was estimated to increase our bank's capital by 19%, which I think may very well have created a potential disadvantage within the U.S. institutions versus our European counterparts.
Tremendo cómo le estaban buscando las cosquillas al bono de Jerome Powell con Basel III, ¿eh? Ya sabéis que Donald Trump y Elon Musk quieren reducir la regulación en el sector bancario. Y aquí, bueno, yo siempre estaba a favor de desregular, aunque el sector bancario es pues una bomba de relojería, porque el no tener regulación pueden llevarle a descalzar plazos de, ya sabéis, ¿no? Los bancos se financian a corto, invierten a largo y se apalancan demasiado. Entonces pueden llevar a corridas bancarias y a crisis financieras que arrasan la economía. Por eso, de hecho, se creó Basel III para evitar este descalce de plazos y riesgo y que los bancos tuviesen pues más provisión de capital, también reservas y, por tanto, evitar, ¿no?, esas crisis financieras similares a la del año 2008, cuando, recordar, los que tengáis ya peines a una cana como yo, parecía que literalmente el sector financiero se iba a caer por completo, ¿no? Bueno, pues básicamente Powell dice que está bien que haya un estándar de regulación, en este caso Basel III, que es lo que quiere eliminar Donald Trump. Bueno, pues según él, vamos a ver si finalmente pueden hacerlo o no. Aquí hay una lucha clara entre el Tesoro, entre el Gobierno y la Reserva Federal. Ya sabéis que Donald Trump quiere interferir en la política monetaria de la Reserva Federal y de momento parece que se mantiene esa independencia, entre comillas, de ambas instituciones, algo que en un marco institucional y una seguridad jurídica adecuada debe tener, que no haya interferencia e injerencia entre Tesoro y Banca Central. No olvidemos que la Banca Central es el que financia, si se monetiza la deuda, al Tesoro. Por lo tanto, sería un poco de país bananero que realmente no existiese esa independencia, ¿no? Bueno, Basel III, han preguntado mucho también sobre criptomonedas, también sobre inflación, también sobre el mercado laboral. Vamos a seguir escuchando al presidente de la Banca Central, Jerome Powell.
And all those things. Once all of that is set, it comes to the Fed, and by that I mean 4 or so of the reserve banks, and we actually make the payment. We take the money out of the Treasury General account and we make the payment. We make no judgments whatsoever. Those are all made upstream from us, and we are in fact the fiscal agent of the Treasury.
Confirm for me today, is the system safe today?
I believe it is, and I will tell you, we are very strongly committed to the integrity, efficacy, resilience, and all those things of this system. And people do depend on this in a big way, and we're committed to that.
One last question for you, sir. The failure of Silicon Valley Bank, and the chairman brought this up. I'm just curious, recognizing a lot of banks out there looked at this. It cost the other banks in the system a lot of money to pick up the costs involved in the losses. Nobody's been fired. But you did indicate that it was a failure in the playbook. Has the playbook been revised, or can we expect that it will be revised?
In a lot of ways, it's been revised, yes. I can go into some details. I mean, one thing that didn't happen was, for example, the supervisors didn't follow through aggressively enough on things that they'd said. If they'd done that could well have been enough to stop it. But a lot of it was just not focusing enough directly on what was a very large amount of interest rate risk, a large portfolio of long-term securities matched up with an unstable funding base. And somehow people wrote about that, and not the Fed, but others wrote publicly about this, but somehow we don't expect bank runs outside of a crisis in this country, and that's what that was. It was a bank run, and bank runs are incredibly damaging. I think everyone learned a lot from that and is determined to do better.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is one that I think, as you appropriately pointed out, I think this is an area where a lot more questions are out there yet, and I think if it's the playbook that was the problem, I think perhaps a discussion about how that playbook has been revised would be appropriate in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Chairman Powell, thank you, and thank you always for the conversations in between these hearings as well. Let me focus on a couple of things of concern, and you touched on a little bit of this, and I think this is important to clarify. There was a change in the law when the CFPB was created. The CFPB examines the banks and enforces the law, whereas the Fed only supervises those banks. Is that correct? Or how would you determine that relationship?
With the CFPB? So Dodd-Frank took a lot of the consumer compliance jurisdiction away from the other banking agencies and gave it to a newly created agency, the CFPB. We retained a residual amount of that, as we just discussed, which was banks under $10 billion in assets. But the CFPB essentially took all of that when Dodd-Frank came into being.
So as it was created, when you two were working together, the Federal Reserve collaborated with the Consumer Bureau when supervising those large banks, correct?
Yes, we still retain supervision over all the holding companies and also of Fed member banks.
And let me ask you this then, does the Federal Reserve enforce consumer protection laws now for things like money transmitters?
Not for money.
That would be the consumer protection. That would be CFPB.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
That's
and
right.
so when we're talking about collaborating with the CFPB for financial technology firms, what would the Fed Reserve now do that if the CFPB, if the hypothetical is the CFPB no longer exists, what would be the Fed's role right now with respect to technology firms?
We don't have jurisdiction over, we have jurisdiction over banks and some financial market utilities.
So let me ask you this, because I know there's a number of Nevadans who filed consumer reports of concerns about fraud and predators with the CFPB. The Fed Reserve doesn't receive those reports, correct?
No, I don't believe so.
And you have no role when it comes to consumer protection like the CFPB does, correct?
Unless you're a Fed member bank that has $10 billion or less in assets, then we have jurisdiction.
Right.
On a
So there is a gap. If the hypothetical is true, and what we're hearing that the CFPB is being shut down, there is a gap, what we're hearing in enforcement out there, and particularly when it comes to consumer protection. Is that, would you say that's true?
Yes, for all banks that we don't supervise.
And I think that's the concern we're all having right now, is this concern of when we're looking to streamline government. And listen, I'll be the first to tell you, there's a lot of bloat. We need to streamline it. We need to address regulations and overreach. But there's a strategic way to do it, and not this burn down the house that is going to harm people across the country, including in my state, those Nevadans that are looking for some sort of enforcement around consumer protection law. So that's what you're hearing from many of us on our side of the aisle here.
Can I just very briefly add that we do have some residual enforcement authorities, but what we don't have is examination authority, and for the banks at the CFPB.
Thank you. Let me ask you this, and you know, we talked about this over the phone, and I understand it may be difficult to answer this, but the Federal Reserve Board members have been clear that future interest rate cuts are unlikely to happen despite the strong economy. But there are folks in my home that are in my state that are waiting to buy a home. And we know that's still an issue, the high prices right now for home affordability. You add the interest rates to it, it is a problem. So do you think it's most likely that interest rates will remain above 6% for this year, or can you even address that?
You know, so overall the economy is strong, growing 2.5% last year. The labor market is also very solid. Unemployment at 4%, quite a low level. Inflation last year was 2.6% for the year. So we're in a pretty good place with this economy. We want to make more progress on inflation, and we think our policy rate is in a good place, and we don't see any reason to be in a hurry to reduce it further. As it relates to housing, so it's true that mortgage rates have remained high, but that's not so directly related to the Fed's rate. It's really related more to long-term bond rates, particularly the Treasury, the 10-year Treasury, 30-year Treasury, for example. And those are high for reasons not particularly closely related to Fed policy. They may remain high. I think, once we lower rates and kind of rates return to a lower level, mortgage rates will come down. I don't know when that'll happen. And even when it does happen, we're still going to have a housing shortage in many places.
Thank you. Chairman Powell, thank you again for being here.
Thank you, ma'am. Next will be Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here. My friend, our ranking member, said that you are knuckling under to the big bank lobbyists. Is that true?
No.
It seems to me that the big picture should not go unnoticed. Do you recall a year or two ago when inflation was raging? I think its peak was about 9%. Many economists and other experts, based in part on history, said that you were going to have to provoke high unemployment and put our country into recession in order to get inflation down. Do you recall that?
Very, very well.
Are we in a recession?
We are not.
Would you, as an American, trade places right now with Germany in terms of the economy?
No, I sure wouldn't.
How about China?
No, wouldn't trade places.
How about France?
No, thanks.
Bueno, seguimos escuchando a Jerome Powell. Vamos a hacer esta parada de un minuto simplemente para destacar dos titulares tremendos que acaba de decir el bueno de Jerome Powell, el presidente de la Reserva Federal. Te están preguntando por el sector bancario, por las hipotecas, que preocupa a muchos ciudadanos americanos, y ha dicho que, obviamente, una vez la Reserva Federal baje los tipos de interés, baje las tasas, será el momento de que las hipotecas, las tasas hipotecarias bajarán. Y le preguntan, ¿cuándo será eso? Y ha dicho, no sé cuándo será eso, o sea que de momento no quiere dar fecha. Pero fijaos a esto, hablando de los bancos, indica que los bancos se encaminan a comprometerse con Basel III, ya sabéis, la legislación de Basel III. ¿Y esto qué significa? Que todos los bancos están en una carrera loca de conseguir oro. Están tratando de comprar oro porque el oro se tiene en cuenta para la fórmula de reducción de riesgo de los propios bancos. Esto que acaba de decir es bastante alcista para el oro y para mineras como Newmont o como Barrick Gold, que lo comentaremos también, por supuesto, en la sesión de mañana. Vamos a seguir escuchando a Powell, lo vamos a conectar también a ver cómo van las operaciones, que van de maravilla, esos largos que hemos cogido en Nasdaq al comenzar el programa. O sea que seguimos escuchando a Powell y luego vamos al set a conectar con los mercados. Vamos a escuchar a Powell.
Help from Congress and on the our president on the fiscal side. I don't expect you to comment on that. You and the Federal Reserve can to a large extent control short rates, can't you?
Yes.
Through the Open Market Committee. You can't control long rates, though, can you?
No, we can't.
Why is that?
So a lot of things go into long rates, and one of them is the expected future short rate of Fed policy, but many other things go in. Expectations of inflation in the longer run, the sort of risks around the economy and around the budget deficit go into something called the term premium, which is the part we can't explain when we do these decompositions. And so, it's set by supply and demand in the bond market at the long end, and we're not particularly. We have some influence, but mostly not.
Many Americans are looking at short rates and looking at the Fed's behavior and how you reduce inflation, but they don't seem they don't see the long rates going down, and obviously that affects mortgage rates. And I would encourage you and your colleagues to spend some time explaining to the American people why that is.
Final question. If you went home tonight and Mayor Powell, your spouse, said, I got a call today from our bank, and they're debanking us. They're worried about their reputational risk because they don't like our politics. Would you think that fair?
No, I sure wouldn't. And as I mentioned earlier, I too am troubled by the quantity of these reports, and really want to understand better why this is happening. One theory is that banks are just very risk averse around BSA and money laundering, and that's because we're so tough on them, and that they just don't. Any red flag is enough. But it may be that this whole thing with reputation risk needs to be thought about. It's actually coming out of our one manual that we use. We're taking that concept out, the manual that we've been using for account access for master accounts. We're just going to take that out. But I think this needs a fresh look, and I think it's time for that, and we're going to do that.
Well, I've asked our chairman, and he has agreed to invite some of the CEOs of some of the banks that have been debanking people. The CEOs,
Yes.
not their lawyers, not their PR consultants,
Not the lobbyists.
not their priests, them, the CEOs to come in and let's talk about this and find out what the hell's been going on.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reid.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Chairman Powell, welcome. Thank you very much. I think your monetary policy combined with the Biden fiscal policy over the last 4 years has made a tremendous difference. We've avoided a recession. And I'd like to remind people how far we've come. In 2020, the gross domestic product decreased 2.2%. The unemployment rate finished the year at 6.7%. By 2024, gross domestic product grew 2.5%. The unemployment rate was 4.1%. Labor force participation rate went up from 61% to 62.5%. And that's a combination of your work together with the fiscal policy of the Biden administration. So I thank you for that. One of the issues before us today is the issue of tariffs. In July 2018 testimony, you stated, Mr. Chairman, countries that have remained open to trade, that have not erected barriers, including tariffs, have grown faster and had higher incomes. Do you still believe that?
Yes, I do. I would stand by that.
So President Trump's tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico will obviously raise costs on families. In fact, some economists, many economists, project about $1,200 per year households will be paying extra. An increase of inflation by nearly 1%, economic growth, depression, and, for example, the increase of the average car price by $2,700. Is that a wise policy?
So I guess I ought to say this. I think the standard case for free trade and all that logically still makes sense. It didn't work that well when we have one very large country that doesn't really play by the rules. And in any case, it's not the Fed's job to make or comment on tariff policy. We, that's for elected people, and it's not for us to comment. Ours is to try to react to it in a thoughtful, sensible way and make monetary policy so that we can achieve our mandate.
Just this weekend, the president removed the board of the Kennedy Center and made himself chairman. What would you do if the president tried to remove a member of the Federal Reserve Board?
Well, it's pretty clearly not allowed under the law.
Thank you. We've communicated back and forth about synthetic risk transfer as a potential danger to the banking system. And could you give us some insights on how we can improve financial stability by regulating these transactions more appropriately?
So what we've been doing for some time now is looking at them on a case-by-case basis. And if they really do transfer risk successfully, then that's okay. I mean, it's a good thing if a bank wants to transfer risk off its balance sheet in a way that it gets compensated for and all that. But what you want to make sure is that the risk is really transferred, and that was the problem during the global financial crisis, was sort of things that appeared to but did not accomplish a transfer of risk. So we see this coming, and we've been looking at these transactions on an ongoing basis.
Well, I commend you for that. In fact, what happens typically is the transaction becomes complicated by synthetic risk transfers, as it was the case with synthetic derivatives. So thank you for your attention to that. We've talked about housing. It's absolutely critical everywhere across the country. We're in a housing shortage. Of course, while housing is difficult, two of the mainstays of our housing market are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, helping to support home ownership. Does the federal guarantee backing Fannie and Freddie help make mortgage rates more affordable and home ownership more accessible, Mr. Chairman?
I imagine it does hold down mortgage rates, the fact that they're a sovereign risk.
And how important is the 30-year mortgage to ensure that families can afford a home?
In our housing market, the 30-year mortgage is very important.
Yeah. And I have heard some discussions about eliminating Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which would be detrimental, I presume, to the housing market.
That's really a question for you. I mean, putting them back in the private, putting housing finance back in the private sector has some appeal over the longer run, but I leave that with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Senator Ricketts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here today to talk about our economy and all the things that are
Bueno, ahora vamos a volver con Powell un minuto, porque queremos ver las posiciones que teníamos. Acabamos de salir del Nasdaq, en principio del programa habíamos entrado en largo. Bueno, vamos a enseñar ya resultados, porque nos ha dejado ya $100, nos ha dejado de beneficio, y seguimos sumando a esta cuenta, a este portfolio, que hace que operamos aquí en directo y en real. Vamos a ver si podemos compartir ya la pantalla y lo vemos. Fijaros, aquí acabamos de cerrar la posición del Nasdaq, que ya hace que la cuenta sume. Esta es una cuenta real, ya lo sabéis. Ahora veremos que está auditada, $3.700. Está en dólares la cuenta, capitalidad con $10.000 en septiembre del 24, y bueno, pues ya con un 37% de rentabilidad. Ya sabéis que es una cuenta que está auditada. Aquí veis la curva, la podéis seguir todos a través de MQL5. Bueno, pues ya veamos este drawdown, este pequeño drawdown, y bueno, pues aquí lo tenéis. Así que bueno, pues contentos evidentemente por la operativa. Fijaos cómo el SP500 también está tirando mucho. Una pena porque no hemos podido entrar. Hablábamos de que la rotura de esta directriz iba a dar el lado largo. Hemos intentado estar buscando en intradía, en gráficos de minuto, pues posicionarnos, pero no ha dejado entrada. Así que bueno, de momento sacamos el Nasdaq. Recordar que todas las posiciones también la vamos, como llaman, TradingPRO.app, está en nuestro portal, nuestra web, ¿verdad? Está sacando ahora mismo un artículo de por qué no habrá alto el fuego en Ucrania. Este fin de semana se celebra, ya sabéis, la Conferencia de Seguridad de Múnich, que va a ser un evento importantísimo. Bueno, aquí podéis leernos, como siempre, en TradingPRO.app, y aquí tenéis el por qué creo que no habrá ese catalizador alcista para las bolsas. También aquí una opinión personal de por qué estamos en contra de los aranceles de Donald Trump. Por eso le están preguntando a Powell sobre los aranceles, bueno, pues muy a la par de lo que decía Powell en esta tesis que hemos desarrollado. Aquí nos podéis seguir, nos podéis leer diariamente, como con los podcasts. Os invito, si alguien no nos conoce, a leernos de forma diaria aquí en TradingPRO.app, uno de los mejores portales de educación financiera e información financiera del mundo, ¿no? Tengo el placer de codirigirlo, así que bueno, aquí nos podéis seguir. Y por supuesto, los que no estéis en la comunidad de Telegram, oye, pasaros por aquí porque es gratuita la comunidad, aquí lo veis, y es la oficial, ¿vale? La comunidad de Telegram, vamos a dejar el link en el chat de YouTube, estamos en directo para que os podáis unir, es gratuita, no se vende nada, así que por supuesto aquí vamos a ir informando de todas las posiciones, las operaciones que hemos ido abriendo. Y el resto de mercados, poca cosa, subidas en bolsa, también subidas ha ido recuperando el oro, y caídas del dólar, es un poco lo que hemos visto, así que interpreta de momento el mercado con mensaje dovish, mensaje suave de J. Powell. Vamos a volver a conectar con el presidente, vamos a escucharle acabar, está a punto de cerrar, así que luego, ya si parece, seguimos comentando la sesión, como digo, a través de la comunidad de Telegram. Como digo, dejaremos el link en el chat de YouTube. Vamos con Powell.
The level that we judge consistent with so-called ample reserves. the most recent data and the feel of the markets is definitely that reserves are still abundant. They're about the level they were at when runoff started, because the runoffs really happened out of the overnight repo facility, reverse repo. So yes, it's an ongoing thing, and we're not yet where we're headed.
So what kind of pace can we expect? And I know that obviously there's going to be a lot of factors like what happens to the economy over the course of next year. But if things were going to go along the way they are today, you've already said the economy's doing well. Inflation's a little higher than we want it to be at 2.6%, but unemployment's at 4%. If these conditions, and I think you used the word stable quite a bit, if these conditions were to remain stable throughout the course of the year, would you have a range that you could give us of where the balance sheet might be if we were talking again here in January 2026?
We basically we're going to be looking at reserve conditions in reserve markets, and trying to stop a little bit above what we consider ample. And we think we're meaningfully above that now. We can't put a number on it because you can't directly know the demand for reserves other than by observing behavior in the market and then putting a little bit of a buffer on it. So I can't give you an exact number, but for now it's ongoing, and we have a ways to go. What kind of conditions would have to happen for you to start going back to quantitative easing? So go to quantitative easing. That's a tool we tend to use when we're at the effective lower bound and we can't cut interest rates anymore. So nothing like what you're seeing in the current day. It's a different test for stopping quantitative tightening, but we would use QE going forward only in a situation where rates are at zero, and we're a long way from zero now. So that you think that, again, just generally speaking then, if things were to remain stable, you'll continue to unwind the balance sheet, you'll continue the quantitative tightening. Can't give me a range on this? Is that what I hear you saying? That's right. That's right. Okay, great. Well, I encourage you to keep doing that, because, again, I think that's important to be able to make sure that you've got powder for the next issue that we may face. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you being here.
Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, good to see you. One of the things we've talked about in the past, and I've got 2 or 3 issues I want to get through fairly quickly, is that that while our regulatory framework should always promote financial innovation, that innovation can't come at the expense of things like anti-money laundering, consumer protection, financial stability. I continue to worry in many of these hearings where we keep seeing this regulatory creep outside the boundaries of traditional financial regulation. I think if we're starting a system from scratch, few of us would design it this way. But it is one of the reasons why I'm looking forward to working with Chair Scott and my colleague, Senator Lummis, on a framework at looking at stable coins in particular within the regulatory perimeter. I know my friend Bill Hagerty just introduced a bill in this area. I'm looking at trying to make sure we get those guardrails put in place, and how it touches the Fed is something that's terribly important to me. I know you and I have talked in the past about the notional idea of same activity, same regulation in the non-bank sector. If you'd like to wax briefly on this question around stable coins and how we think about them in the same point of, if they are similar to other activities, should they not have the same regulatory structure? So we definitely support these efforts to create a regulatory framework around stablecoins. Stablecoins may have a big future with consumers and businesses. We can't know that now, but it is important for the development of stablecoins in a safe and sound manner, and a manner that protects consumers and savers and all, that there be a regulatory framework. So we see these bills, and we're in contact as we were in the last Congress, and trying to add our technical thoughts and how to do this. And we think it's a very constructive exercise. Well, we do think, you have a lot of expertise in this session, and there are people come with lots of opinions on everything in crypto, from over the top to the other end of the spectrum. And I'm gonna need to rely on your expertise as well as we try to work through some framework for stable coins. I know there are a lot of earlier questions on CFPB. I think the record is pretty darn good. It's returned $20 billion to consumers. Matter of fact, last time we had the previous chair here, Chair Rohit, Mr. Chopra, we were talking about $55 million to Virginians. I do have to mention this more for my colleagues. Tim Kaine and I did a teletown hall last night. Lots of things happening in Virginia. Normally we would get maybe 3,000, 5,000, 6,000 folks on a teletown hall. We had 60,000 last night. I have not seen anything like that in my time up on here on the Hill. And a huge amount of concern about what the Doge boys are doing, whether our information is safe, whether privacy is protected. I had one lady say, in light of what was happening at CFPB, and while there's not a direct connection, she's saying is her deposits at her bank safe? We tried to give her a assurance, but I said, you know what, ma'am, I'm going to be talking to the chairman of the Federal Reserve tomorrow. And with this diminution or shuttering, at least at the time being, of the CFPB, can I tell, I believe her name was Mary, can I tell Mary from Virginia that her bank account is safe?
I think bank accounts overall across the economy are safe. Yes, we've still got deposit insurance at the FDIC, and the banking system is well capitalized and safe.
Well, again, I think the concern was being raised was that the diminution of consumer protections lent her concerns about whether that dollar being safe. Last thing I want to recognize is that there's been reports in the media about the thinness in the Treasury markets, the number of additional bonding that we're going to have to do, particularly with so many of these unpaid tax cuts. Matter of fact, one of the things that was really striking to me was that yesterday the president mentioned how he was, quote, examining Treasury debt payments for possible fraud, and suggested that our debt might not be as high as possible. We all understand the full faith and credit of the United States is based upon a reputation. If this president were to suddenly say, I'm wiping off X amount of debt because I don't believe we owe it, what kind of effect would that have on both stability of the dollar and the overstability of our economy?
It will probably not surprise you that I will defer to you on that question.
So you think it would be, from a Fed standpoint, the President of the United States starts to saying we're not going to pay our Treasury debt, you're going to have no view at all?
I'm not going to comment on things that the President says.
I would like to see us at some point get a stronger answer on that, because I think that in light of the president's willingness to shut down agencies willy-nilly, his ability to potentially curtail payment of debt, I think would have devastating consequences on our economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Britt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation both in and out of this hearing room today. Conversations about a co-president referencing Elon Musk, referencing the work that Doge is doing. I think it's important to remember that President Trump ran on this. I mean, he said we're going to look for wasteful spending across our government. We're $36 trillion in debt, y'all. That's not only fiscally irresponsible, it is actually morally irresponsible. And the difference in this administration and the last administration is that President Trump is actually the final arbiter. And it's interesting that none of you had anything to say over the last 4 years when it is clear that our commander-in-chief was not in command. And if we're going to use the term co-president, then let's go back and say co-president Jake Sullivan, co-president Ron Klain, co-president Jill Biden. I mean, it seems that some of the biggest decisions were made during the president's afternoon nap time. And so I just think we need to be a little bit more honest about what's been laid out and what's actually occurring. Chair Powell, I want to discuss some monetary policy issues, but I first want to highlight a few supervisory items. We unfortunately started 2023 with several bank failures in which the Fed itself admits its supervisors were, quote, too slow to ask. The question has been asked earlier about who was fired, who was not. I think that there's some real merit to having accountability that we have not seen there. In the aftermath of those failures, the Fed was certainly not slow to act when it came to new regulations, like the new capital requirements that would have put the U.S. banks at a global disadvantage and actually hurt consumers in my state. The way I look at this is the world came up with a gold standard, and then Vice Chair Barr said, "Hold my beer." And unfortunately, that hurts Alabamians. In addition to that, we had Community Reinvestment Act and stress testing frameworks that were basically adopted in secret, or as we discussed last week, the reputational risk and just the arbitrary nature of that and those standards that were used to push political agendas. None of this is acceptable, and we've got to take a look at how to promote greater accountability and transparency into the Fed's supervisory function. Shifting gears, as of January 30th, the Federal Reserve had a mark-to-market loss on its balance sheet of roughly $221 billion. In fact, I looked back and the Fed has posted losses since September of 2022. Meanwhile, we've seen transfers to the CFPB totaling $2 billion since September of 2022. So just to clarify, Chair Powell, these money transfers are requested by the CFPB director each quarter and then directly deposited by the Fed. Is that how that works?
So the director of the CFPB requests money, and we, under the law, we send that money. Yes.
So, in fact, but Dodd-Frank actually prohibits the Fed from actually reviewing or amending those requests.
That is correct.
And so it gives full discretion to the CFPB
up to I think 12% of our. There's a ceiling on that, but that's correct.
So just to level set, how many times has the CFPB funding request been denied by the Fed?
We don't have the authority to deny it under the law.
Zero, right?
Zero. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And by the way, I'd like to applaud the current administration and acting director vote for inserting some accountability back into the agency by pausing these quarterly just blank checks. On that, I know there's been a lot of conversation around the Bureau over the last few days, but I do want to focus on those last couple of years, particularly the $2 billion the CFPB received from September 2022 up to the last receipt on January 2nd, 2025. Congress specified in statute that the Fed shall fund the CFPB through the combined earnings of the Federal Reserve System. However, as I mentioned, the Fed has no current earnings. It has a balance sheet of negative $200 billion. So instead of the recent audit statement saying the Fed is funding the CFPB through assessments on its reserve banks, Mr. Chair, there are only two statutes that authorize the Fed to make reserve bank assessments, and neither permit the CFPB to fund transfers. So what authority exactly did the Federal Reserve have to assess the reserve banks in this manner over the last 2 years? I just wanted kind of a fact finding.
We looked at that question very carefully, and it's very clear on the law and the legislative history that we're still required to make those payments to do so.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would point out that candidate Trump did not run on implementing Project 2025. In fact, when he was asked on the campaign trail about Project 2025, he said, "I don't know anything about that. Who are those people?" And yet he early on and quickly installed a key architect of Project 2025, Russ Vought, as the head of the Office of Management and Budget, which we know is the command and control center for the budget overseeing all federal agencies. And that's what Elon Musk is doing now. He's implementing Project 2025, the same Project 2025 that candidate Trump said he knew nothing about. And he said that because he knew it was unpopular. He knew it would be unpopular to take the financial cop off the beat. And I want to start by talking about what's happening over at CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because that is the cop on the beat to go after fraudsters and scammers who cheat Americans out of their hard-earned money. And they have returned billions of dollars to our constituents, to the consumers who have been victims of these scams. And in doing so, they've earned some powerful enemies who want to shut them down. And Elon Musk is doing that dirty work on behalf of those fraudsters. And there's something especially twisted about the richest man in the world shutting down an agency that helps victims of scammers and fraudsters recover just a little bit of their hard-earned money. And I find it especially interesting that the new self-declared head of the CFPB, Russell Vought, told employees not to come into the office and essentially to stop work. Here's what he wrote, and I'm quoting, "Employees should not come into the office," unquote, and stand down from performing any work task, unquote. So this is an interesting situation. Federal employees continue to get paid, but the Trump administration tells them to stop doing their work. That apparently is what the Trump administration thinks is a good deal for the American taxpayer, to pay employees to not to do their job. So, Mr. Chairman, I have a simple question for you. Is that a practice that you pursue at the Fed, to pay your employees but tell them not to come to work? Have you done that?
No.
That wouldn't be very efficient, would it? No, it wouldn't. And yet, that's what the so-called Doge boys, efficiency boys, are doing. In addition to that, they're rummaging through the private, very personal, sensitive information of Americans at the Department of Treasury. So it seems to me that the Trump administration and Elon Musk are focused on everything except what Donald Trump said he was going to focus on during the campaign, which was to bring prices down. And when you look at the price of eggs these days, I noticed that Waffle House just instituted a new 50-cent per egg surcharge due to the nationwide rise in the cost of eggs. They said that's going to be a new surcharge, and other restaurants are following suit. You've seen that, right, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah. And at the same time, the Trump administration has restricted federal agencies from providing the public with information about the bird flu, avian flu, which is part of the cost of egg increases. So what we're really facing here is an administration that campaigned on bringing down prices and is not doing that, did not campaign on Project 2025, and that's what they're doing. But when it comes to prices, Mr. Chairman, the president's also talking about significant increases in tariffs. Our Republican colleagues are also talking about passing a tax bill that gives way disproportionately to the super wealthy, and which will add trillions to the deficit by their own account. We're talking about playing around with the baseline. So my question to you is simple. All things being equal, do big increases in tariffs and increasing the deficit and debt put upward pressure on inflation? Isn't that simple math?
You know, it really does remain to be seen what tariff policies will be implemented, and I just think it would be unwise to speculate when we really don't know. I mean, we see proposals, but it's so hard to say what's going to happen. And
Well, last time the Trump administration was in office, the Fed took actions because they were concerned about the impact of increasing tariffs. Isn't that the case?
We wound up cutting rates in 2000 and I guess it was 19, but it really was because growth slowed and confidence was weak and the global economy was weakening. So the net effect of all that's what we look at. And it's really not just tariffs. It's tariffs, immigration, fiscal policy, and regulatory policy. And those will all go into a mix, and we'll try to make sense of it and do what's right for monetary policy.
If you could just get back to me, I'm not on the question of increasing the deficit by trillions of dollars and what impact you believe that has on inflation and prices. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. I think you're aware of what direction my questions will
take. They will be focused on the bank supervision function of the Fed. And I'd point out that when you and I were toddlers, 1956, the chairman of the Fed at the time, William McChesney Martin, said that the Federal Reserve Board is an agency of the Congress. Ben Bernanke said something similar in 2013 when he told Janet Yellen that, quote, Congress is our boss. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, the way I always say it is that our supervision, our accountability runs through the legislative branch, not through the executive branch, as it does in many other forms of government.
Thank you for that, because I wouldn't have guessed that that was going to be your response. The way that the Fed has behaved for the last 4 years in its relationship with the U.S. Congress is to thumb its nose at Congress. Your staff has repeatedly stymied information requests from this committee, notably made by myself, the chairman, the ranking member, Senator Tillis, former Senator Pat Toomey, and others. In my experience, the Fed is a black hole. It consumes information, but it never releases it. Your fellow governors have personally misled me on at least 2 occasions with respect to Wyoming and digital assets. And in recent federal court filings, former Senator Pat Toomey has accused your staff of lying to him while providing technical assistance on legislation that passed in the National Defense Authorization Act in 2022. Now, I have behind me a statement by the Fed's General Counsel, one of the staff that's sitting behind you today, who said, quote, the Fed generally resists legislative prescriptions. Now, to me, that's thumbing his nose at Congress, the very people that you and I just agreed you are responsible to and the people depend on. So this is why the American people think there's a deep state. This is why they think there are faceless bureaucrats making policy to hurt the very people of this country. Just look at the mess the Fed made of Silicon Valley Bank. And I contend that there is a lack of understanding that is deliberate on the part of the Fed with respect to digital asset policy. So the Constitution says Congress is your boss, but somehow your staff have not gotten that message. So, Chairman Powell, do you commit on behalf of yourself and the Federal Reserve staff to comply fully with all document demands issued by this committee in a timely manner?
Sure.
Will you instruct your staff to be complete in their responses and not to obstruct the oversight functions of this committee?
You know, we always work with the committee to be responsive to your requests. Sometimes they're beyond our capacity to respond to, and we work with committee and with committee staff to do that, but we're always responsive to committee requests.
And I'll look forward to engaging with you when you feel that our requests are outside of the scope of the oversight that we have over the Fed. Do you commit to disciplining or removing any staff that are found to have engaged in debanking activity, furthering Operation Choke Point 2.0, or other misconduct?
I can't make an open-ended commitment to remove anybody, but I will tell you that I am struck, and my colleagues and I are struck by the by the growing number of cases of what appears to be debanking, and we're determined to take a fresh look at that. In fact, I took the thing that you showed during the debanking hearing. When I saw that, we're now taking that out of the manual. So I thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's up.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us today. I appreciate your presence here. I'd like to start with the issue of the rising cost of home ownership, something that I know is of great interest to many of my colleagues on this committee. I know, Mr. Chair, that you care a lot about home ownership and making home ownership accessible and available to folks. My colleague, Senator Lummis, as well, many of the folks on my side of the aisle as well. And so I think this is something that we can agree on, that the rising cost of home ownership is a big challenge for our constituents, for Americans. And one of the big pressures, there are many, but one of the big pressures is the rising cost of home insurance. In Minnesota, families, seniors are struggling to manage a nearly 40% increase in home insurance rates. We've seen this over the last 7 years or so. And I know, Chair Powell, that you've told this committee in the past that that rising cost of buying insurance for your home has been a source of inflation as we've been trying to manage inflation. Now, I don't know anyone who doesn't see this crisis of rising insurance rates as being caused by extreme weather events. We've seen massive flooding in southeastern United States. We've seen flooding in Minnesota. We've seen fires in the Mountain West in California. I mean, these are climate-related events. That's not a political position. That is just a fact. So, we've got banks that, of course, require, understandably, that a homeowner provide insurance as a predicate for getting a mortgage. So there's a big question about what's going to happen when insurance becomes unaffordable, or in some parts of the country, just literally not available, and what impact that would have on the mortgage markets, on the value of American homes. Just last week, a new analysis from First Street showed that overall, the value of U.S. real estate could be reduced by $1.4 trillion, colleagues, over the next 30 years due to unaccounted for climate risk. That's the cost, the risk of not being able to afford home insurance because of these extreme weather events. And the prospect of trillions of dollars of property become uninsurable is clearly a recipe, it seems to me, for market instability, both in the rental as well as the mortgage market. So my question, Chair Powell, is, given these trends, how do you think the Fed and how do you think we should be thinking about the challenges that these events are going to pose to insurance markets and to the overall financial stability of the economy? I'm not asking you to comment specifically on climate change, because I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle see that as a political question. It's more like what you see as the risk to financial stability here.
So let me quickly note that we don't regulate or supervise insurance companies for the most part, but we're seeing the same thing, which is both banks and insurance companies are pulling out of areas, coastal areas and things like that, or areas where there are a lot of fires. So what that is going to mean is that, if you fast forward 10 or 15 years, there are going to be regions of the country where you can't get a mortgage, there won't be ATMs, there won't, the banks won't have branches and things like that. Right. That's a possibility coming up down the road. It's not that the banks will stay there and keep making loans in the face of evidence of disaster, or that insurance companies will do right policies. They can cancel those policies every year.
Right.
So I think the risk is that they just won't be there and that people won't be able to get them. That's really the issue.
And it seems to me that that would be a massive source of instability in our economy overall if you were to see that kind of dramatic decline in home ownership, home values. Not to mention the disruption that would occur if people literally couldn't be in their homes anymore. So
I think it's going to fall, if that happens, it'll fall on homeowners and residents, but it'll also fall on state and local governments, which you see happening now, where they're stepping in states where insurance is going away, private insurance. You're seeing states step in because they want those areas to remain prosperous. So I don't know that it's a financial stability issue, but it certainly will have significant economic consequences.
Well, certainly to try to figure out how to provide reinsurance as an example, and the places where commercial insurance isn't available would be a massive impact on state budgets, if to follow your chain of thinking. And I know in this committee, I've heard some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle talk about the challenges overall with flood insurance, just as an example, and the massive expense that would have for us as well. I raise this, colleagues, because I think that this is an important issue that we need to be paying attention to. I do think it has a fundamental impact on the overall health of our economy as we look not even down the road, but where we are right now. So I'm out of time. Thank you, Chair Powell. I have a question. You and I have talked quite frequently about my deep and keen interest in the Community Reinvestment Act, and I'll follow up with a question on that for the record.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Hagerty.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Chairman Powell, it's good to see you here today. Welcome. I want to start by talking to you a bit about markets and inflation. Less than 6 months ago, you expressed some serious concerns about labor market weakness and the risk of persistent inflation. But since then, the FOMC has begun its easing cycle and cut its target rate by 100 basis points, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. Now, in the January meeting, the FOMC has telegraphed that it felt both the labor market and inflation have reached a point where you're comfortable maintaining its target range. And my question is this: the recent market data, including last week's strong jobs report, indicate that the economy is on firm ground. Indeed, swaps markets have begun to price in fewer and fewer cuts this year. And I just wanted to talk broadly about these market conditions that you see. Do you see evidence of a higher neutral rate emerging at this point?
Yes, I mean, let me say there was a lot of reason to be concerned about downside risk in the labor market toward the middle of this year, but really that concern has diminished significantly. The labor market's very strong. I think the evidence is, my own view, and there are many different views on this, but is that the neutral rate will have risen meaningfully. Very hard to be precise about it from what it was. It was clearly very, very low before the pandemic. It extraordinarily low, historically so. But yes, I think it's moved up, and many of my colleagues on the FOMC feel that way too.
It certainly seems that way. I'd like to turn now to what seems to be a very popular topic right at this point, and that's the CFPB. In your response to Senator Britt's question earlier, you confirmed that when the CFPB submits quarterly funding requests, the Fed is not in a position to exercise any discretion over what the funds are used for. Is that correct?
As long as it's compliant with the law.
It just strikes me that the Fed is not in a position to hold the CFPB accountable for what it does or how it spends its money. Congress hasn't been allowed to hold the CFPB accountable for what it does or how it spends its money. It looks like no one has been able to hold the CFPB accountable at all. And now I hear, complaints coming from every corner, particularly from the other side, complaints about the excessive delegation of authority to a Republican CFPB director when this entity was intentionally created to be wholly unresponsive to elected officials. So I just find that quite rich. Before I close, I'd like to come to a point on climate, and particularly the Fed's forays into climate activism that have taken place over these past 4 years and the recent retrenchment that we've seen. It's one thing for the Fed to disassociate from its past climate activism in a press release, but to credibly claim that it's divorced itself from partisan climate policies, the Fed needs to do more than just issue statements. It needs to actually end its climate policies. The Fed's independence from politics is a headline topic at the moment, of course, and while much attention has been given to potential external pressures on the Fed, I think it's also critical that we scrutinize how the Fed's own regulation and supervision might be utilized to in some way politicize the institution. So when the central bank strays from its mandate by embracing partisan climate policies, the Fed embroils itself in controversial political debates and invites legitimate political scrutiny. So I just want to urge the Fed to refocus entirely on its core statutory mandates. I know it's a commitment that both you and I share, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Warnock. Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, and welcome again, Chairman Powell. I want to echo the words of Ranking Member Warren and so many of my colleagues today on DOGE and Project 2025's illegal attack on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Certainly the Bureau was not created to be dismantled.
And since its inception, the CFPB has been the only federal agency solely dedicated to protecting Americans' wallets and pocketbooks from scammers and predatory companies in financial services. The CFPB reduced costs for Americans, returning more than $21 billion to Americans who have been cheated since its inception. I want us to focus on that as folks are talking about chasing after waste and fraud and abuse. The CFPB has returned more than $21 billion to Americans. Make no mistake, this attack on the CFPB will increase costs for Americans, and it will give the green light to fraudsters and predatory actors seeking to cheat hardworking Americans. And so, Chairman Powell, thousands of Georgians of all political stripes have written into my office, and they are alarmed by an unelected billionaire and his hacksters' dangerous attempts to access Americans' private data and the Treasury Department's systems that control $6 trillion in annual payments to millions of American citizens, including Social Security, Medicare, and tax refunds. Quickly, yes or no, has Elon Musk or members of his team, to your knowledge, attempted to access the Fed's protected data and systems? Yes or no?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so.
Okay, so will you commit to report to this committee, majority and minority, immediately should you become aware of any such attempt by Elon Musk or Doge to pierce the Fed's independence or to access its protected systems?
Yes.
Thank you for that commitment. The Fed's latest monetary policy report states that the tight labor market has allowed employment and earnings gaps between Black and Hispanic Americans and white Americans to narrow. I was glad to see that many of the long-standing disparities in employment and wages by sex, race, ethnicity, and education have narrowed under the Biden administration. Some gaps have reached historic lows. Specifically, the employment gap for Black workers and white workers is near its lowest point in almost 50 years. That is the economy that the Trump administration is inheriting, a historic low in almost 50 years. Chair Powell, as you work to promote maximum employment, what steps will the Fed take to ensure that these equity gains are permanent?
So the best thing we can do is it's both of our mandates, really, because as you well know, high inflation hits people at the low end of the income spectrum first and most. And in addition to that, we know that the benefits of a strong labor market over time can be really visible and important in those communities as well. So we pursue our mandate. We keep our heads down, and it works out that is the single best thing we can do to foster, closing those gaps.
You pursue your mandate. You want to make sure that it's working. Would you agree that we still need good equity data to continue to narrow and close those gaps by race and gender?
I do think, we're always going to be in favor of good data at the Fed, and we do have quite a bit of that data on our website.
But if we don't have equity data, it'd be difficult to know, right?
Yes.
I'm glad to hear you still believe in the value of good equity data for economic policy making. It's better to fly with the data than to fly blind. I'm not sure what's so controversial about the data. And while I was disappointed to hear that the Federal Reserve, which is independent from the White House, it scrubbed a diversity and inclusion section from its website after President Trump's executive order, while also scrubbing data on the racial, ethnic, and gender makeup of its economists and researchers, I hope you will continue to ensure that the public has good data on how our economy is working or not working for historically marginalized Americans. I also hope you will reconsider your decisions around the whitewashing of the Fed's website. Chair Powell, as we think about the value of protecting data on the Black-white wealth gap or employment gap, I think it's important to understand what policymakers can learn from this data. Historically, from what you've seen in the data, historically, what types of economic events have caused the Black-white wealth gap or employment gap to widen?
Well, high inflation, downturns, you see generally, just take the black unemployment rate, it generally moves at twice the speed of the white unemployment rate. So when it goes up faster, and when it comes down faster. But there is, at the end of the day, there's always been a gap, and we want to run a strong labor market, and we target overall overall labor market conditions for maximum employment. But one of the benefits of that is that gap comes down.
Thank you so much. We all know that fully deregulating our financial regulators like the CFPB, firing bank examiners at the FDIC, or weakening the Fed's supervisory capacity makes an economic shock or recession more likely. We know that this disproportionately impacts Black and Hispanic workers, and there are real consequences to weakening and eliminating financial regulations that keep us safe. Working people are the ones especially who suffer. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to close these gaps. Senator Banks is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair Powell, thank you for presenting your report to the committee today and for coming to meet with me last week in my office as well. The Federal Reserve has enormous power over Americans' ability to work and earn a living. And the Fed's interest rate decisions have an especially big impact on industries like manufacturing, which depend on big investments. Chair Powell, the Fed's data on manufacturing is still holding up nationally, but it doesn't look very good in the Chicago region, which includes most of my state in Indiana. The Beige Book says manufacturing jobs are declining and fewer people are buying manufactured products. It also says that steel demand is at a low level, auto production has slowed, and machinery orders are down. What does that say about the rest of the country? When manufacturing in the heartland slows, does that signal trouble for industries in other parts of the country?
It can. It doesn't always, but it certainly can. We watch the manufacturing sector. It's very important. Manufacturing jobs tend to be high productivity jobs. They're very important in our economy. But I would say over the last couple of years, manufacturing was pretty weak during years in which we had high GDP overall. Manufacturing is a smaller proportion of the economy than it used to be, but it's still extremely important.
Senator Reid asked you why free trade doesn't work when one of the giant players doesn't abide by the rules. The China shock is proof of that. The Fed has a mandate to maximize employment. How do you account for the whole industry that is repeatedly suffocated by unfair competition?
We don't do trade policy. We're not responsible for it. We don't comment on those who do trade policy. So we don't really have a role in focusing specifically on that. That really is left to those who have responsibility over trade.
Do you agree that a healthy manufacturing economy is important to a healthy overall U.S. economy, though?
I do.
I hope you had an opportunity to read Robert Lighthizer February 6th essay in the New York Times. He explains why a big trade imbalance between any two countries is harmful to citizens in both of those countries. How does the Fed take the trade deficit into account in your decision-making at all?
Again, we really don't. We're aware of it, but it's not something that directly affects our mandate goals.
So not at all?
No. I did read his book, by the way. I didn't read that editorial.
Fair enough. It is a good book as well. I want to get into tariffs. It's no secret that most conventional economists hate tariffs. But I want to note that Indiana gained manufacturing jobs during President Trump's first term with the 2018-2019 tariffs. Even though the economist's conventional wisdom is that tariffs will reduce jobs, do you commit to following the data and not prejudge any outcome?
Very much so, as we did in 2018-19.
Finally, my staff reviewed the research paper on tariffs in preparation for this hearing, and I want to point out one of them called The Employment Consequences of U.S. Trade Wars. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this paper for the record. It found that the timing of tariffs are very important. It found that China's retaliation to President Trump's tariffs did hurt U.S. jobs, but if the U.S. had imposed tariffs on China much earlier in the 90s and early 2000s, it would have almost completely eliminated job losses due to the China shock. I know you've said what you said before, but will you and your staff please take a look at this paper?
We certainly will. I imagine we already have, but I'd love to see it.
I appreciate that. Home ownership is an essential part of the American dream, but families are struggling to afford homes. In just 5 years, the price of a typical home in Indiana has gone up more than 60%. More than 3/4 of American families can't afford an average home in their neighborhood. How do the Fed decisions about monetary policy affect the ability of regular families to buy a home?
Most of what will have driven that increase will be about some of it's about local regulation, as you I'm sure know. It's also about just wages going up and costs of materials and things like that going up. And land costs and all that are going up a lot. The channel that through which we affect housing is, of course, interest rates. And right now, interest rates are still pretty high, but actually, mortgage rates are really not set at the Fed. Those are really key off of longer run things. Nonetheless, we're clearly having an effect on the housing market, and that'll unwind as we normalize policy. But we're still going to be faced with high insurance costs and high material costs and labor shortages and all the things that keep driving housing prices up across the country.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Next will be Senator Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Powell, just kind of running along that vein of thought, the housing costs are one of the top concerns of my constituents in Arizona. From 2010 to 2022, rents in Arizona increased by 72%, and I wish wages were as increased to match, but they did not. And the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate has been above 6% for nearly 30 months. With very few rate cuts anticipated in the near future, potential cost increase from tariffs or imported construction materials, as well as the demand that we're going to see in terms of rebuilding from California and labor shortages. What do you think needs to happen to make housing more affordable in Arizona and the United States in general?
You know, housing policy and things to help housing supply are really in your wheelhouse, not ours. I do think you know, the housing markets around the country are still suffering from the after effects of the pandemic. Once that's all the way through and short-term rates are down to normal, whatever the new normal level is, I think housing costs are still going to be high. I think it's still going to be expensive to build housing in many parts of the country where lots of the urban areas, the obvious places to build housing has happened. So I think it's a long-term. There's a short-term problem which will go away in coming years, but there's a longer-term problem with housing availability, and that's going to be something that's not within our authorities or power to affect.
You know, one of the things that I've seen in Arizona is because we have people that are locked into mortgages at 2.9, 2.8%, and in order for them to move to the new house, they're going to have to essentially go and try to get, quote-unquote, a bigger house, but the mortgage payment is going to be through the roof. And while I know the Fed doesn't set the mortgage rate, at the same time, one of the biggest drivers, obviously, of inflation, especially in places like Arizona, is housing costs. And then one of the biggest decisions, essentially, you make on whether or not to move rates is inflation, which is driven by housing costs. So we're in this kind of perpetual vicious circle in Arizona when it comes to interest rates. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I just want to say at least for there to be some understanding on that, because it's the reason we're not breaking out of this cycle is because the problem kind of feeds itself over and over and over again.
Yes, that's exactly what's going on, but it's not obvious, though, that lower rates would lead to lower housing inflation, because, of course, that would increase housing demand. It would unlock people's, low mortgages, but that creates both a buyer and a seller. So it's not clear that would be something that would drive down housing inflation.
Well, my supposition, especially in places like Arizona, which is really growing fast, is that by increasing supply with lower rates, you end up essentially having more of a competitive market, so people will start moving and essentially bring down the overall cost. But moving on, so I've also heard from businesses in Arizona, they're concerned about the threat of economic stability in tariffs that are imposed on our key U.S. trade partners. How should we expect prices to move for basic items like tomatoes, peppers, cars, and the like if we place a 25% tariff on Mexico next month, as the president has threatened?
So, as you know, we don't do tariff policy, and we don't do commentary on tariff policy. I think just generally, when somebody's got to pay the tariff, and it can be the exporter, it can be the importer, it can be a middleman, and it
Somebody
could be the
pays for it,
consumer.
though.
Somebody does, but in some cases it doesn't reach the consumer much. In some cases it does, and it really does depend on facts that we haven't seen yet.
But that also contributes to some of the calculations on inflation overall.
It can, but
it's hard to predict.
There's a question of how persistent that would be and how large it would be.
Mm-hmm. So, and of course, I understand you're not here to specifically comment on trade policy, but overall, is it your opinion, let's just say a base opinion, that high tariffs can lead to higher costs, which would then end up being seen in terms of your inflation calculation that helps you set the rates?
So I'd say that's a possible outcome, which will depend very much on specific facts about what's being tariffed for how long, et cetera.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and Chairman Powell, good to see you again. In the past 5 years alone, the national debt has exploded. Federal spending and the debt have increased by more than 50%. Debt held by the public, or true debt obligation, has more than tripled during the past 15 years, reaching more than $28 trillion. All told, U.S. national debt is now over 120% of our GDP. And runaway spending contributed to a regressive tax on all Americans, a tax known as inflation. In the past 5 years, the cost of living has skyrocketed for working-class Pennsylvanians, especially, as you and I discussed when we visited, those relying on fixed incomes. And unfortunately, that compounded effect of inflation has not been offset by commensurate rise in wages for many Pennsylvanians. I've heard from countless Pennsylvanians who had to count their dollars at the gas pump, cancel family trips, even tighten their belts at the dinner table because of inflation. So while we discuss these heady issues, let's not lose sight of the very real human cost of the decisions made by people sitting in this room. And given that cost, I'd like to ask you about the national debt and the cost of financing it. We now spend more to service the debt annually than we do on national defense. So how concerned are you about the accelerating pace of government borrowing and the borrowing cost, which will affect families in the form of higher mortgage rates?
Yeah, we don't comment on fiscal policy other than to say that, as my predecessors have said, that the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path. It's not that the level of spending or the level of the debt itself is unsustainable. It's that the path is unsustainable, and ultimately the level of the debt will be. So there's no time like the present to start working on this. The longer we wait, the more painful it will be. It's something we need to do and will have to do in the long run, and the short run is better than the long run for that.
And just as a practical matter, how do you factor that into your policy thinking and decisions?
We don't. We're here to achieve maximum employment and price stability, and it's really up to Congress to deal with fiscal issues, and we leave that to you.
Well, just as a more practical question, I think which falls clearly in your bailiwick, because of that national debt, it's caused the supply of U.S. Treasuries needed to finance the debt to skyrocket. And that's at the same time the Fed is shrinking its holdings of Treasury through quantitative tightening. So the question is, or could you at least give us some insight into the impact that this is having on the Treasury market as investors must absorb that supply? And in particular, I'm interested in how the biggest holders of U.S. Treasuries, how their behavior is changing as debt increases.
So this is a real Treasury question, but I think from our standpoint, I can say that there are lots of buyers for Treasuries, but Treasury buyers are going to be factoring in their assessments of the supply that's coming, and that may be part of the reason why the term premium has increased, as you know, over the course of this year. Although the rates have been going up and down lately, they're almost back to where they were before the election.
I know the Fed has been moving forward with comprehensive changes to the stress test process. Could you discuss how you're thinking about reducing the volatility of the results and increasing transparency on the stress test?
So on transparency, we're going to release the models, clean them up and publish the models, put them out for comment. And in terms of volatility, We're also going to, by the way, we're also going to release the stress test scenarios before we implement them. In terms of volatility, what we said we would do is average the changes to, the problem is the stress capital buffer can be moving up and down just because of volatility in the results. And it seemed like a good idea to smooth that out by averaging over a couple of years. We're putting all this out for comment, though, and ultimately we'll reflect those comments in the final decisions we make.
Thank you. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator McCormick. Senator Blunt Rochester.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you, Chairman Powell. It's good to see you, and thank you for meeting with me last week. We discussed everything from jobs and housing supply to the real impact on Fed policies on all of our lives. And I also got a chance to share with you just the concerns and consternation of Delawareans who, for the past few weeks, have been frightened by firings and funding freezes, and just the real impact on people's financial and personal data and information when, DOJ has access to this information. I'm hearing from my constituents as well about the potential shuttering of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. As Senator Warnock mentioned, CFPB has returned over $21 billion to millions of consumers, and that's a real impact. But I want to also highlight that it was your leadership in the Fed working with Congress and the Biden administration to really help answer that question that you were asked about if you had the choice to switch countries with France and Germany and others, that you said no, you'd rather be here. And that success is a testament to all of us. We came together during a really tough economic time at the end of this, during a pandemic, and it limited the recession and job losses. And since COVID, we've seen a robust job growth. But we also have grappled with inflation that drove prices up for so many goods. And I've worked to address one part of this phenomenon, our supply chain disruptions. In fact, I recently joined Senators Cantwell and Blackburn to reintroduce the bipartisan Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act to address supply chain vulnerabilities. And while we see indications that inflation may be slowing, too many of our constituents are still facing high prices and economic uncertainty. We need to do everything that we can to address this anxiety and the realities that Americans are facing. And there seems to be a disconnect. While the economy is doing, well here, on the ground, people aren't really feeling that. So, Mr. Powell, can you talk about, from your perspective, just what is driving this disconnect between traditional economic indicators, such as GDP growth and the stock market performance, and the tangible benefits for families?
I'd be glad to. So it is clear that the overall aggregate numbers are just very, very good for the economy. 4% unemployment, inflation down to 2.6% last year, and the economy growing well in excess of 2%. These are good numbers. But what people are feeling is the results of several years of inflation, and particularly for people in the low and moderate income category, they're really feeling it. So if you look at the earnings releases and press conferences that they do, that companies like the dollar stores and things like that do, who deal a lot with low and moderate income people, they're all telling you that those consumers are feeling really strapped. So we do understand that, and we try to keep that in mind. Even though we acknowledge that the overall data are good, we see what people are feeling, and that's inflation. So it's just another reminder how much people hate inflation and how bad inflation is for people, high inflation, and it just furthers our resolve to get inflation back to 2% and keep it there.
Thank you. One of the big areas that I focus on, you've heard many of us across the aisle talk about the housing crisis that we have in this country. And I know a few others have asked questions previous to me about this, but I would love to follow up afterwards with specifically what you think are the short-term and long-term things that we can do to really address the housing supply and affordability crisis. I have legislation that looks at things like reducing regulatory barriers, zoning reform, these things that we know we can, in partnership with local governments, make a significant difference. And so if I could, would love, again, to follow up with you, even cutting red tape, those kinds of things that we can do long-term and short-term. But I did want to mention one last thing in the 20 seconds that I have. The Fed listens, things that you do, activities that you do. Could you talk a little bit about that as well? Because working people, a lot of times people don't feel that they have a place in these kind of conversations. But can you talk about what the Fed does with Fed listens?
So briefly, we did this as part of our review 5 years ago, and we do it on an ongoing basis now. And the idea is that we break out from the usual people that we talk to, which is a pretty diverse group, and try to deal directly with people who are experiencing the economy and our policies. And it's quite eye-opening to listen to people talk about it. We had one person at the Chicago conference 5 years ago who said the expansion, which was then 9 years old, is just reaching my community. And he talked for some minutes about how companies were going into prisons and finding people who weren't going to get out for a year or two and training them and stuff like that. You could hear a pin drop. It was very telling stuff. So I think we learned from all that. And so we'll keep doing it.
Well, I will end by saying there's a famous quote, I think it's Martin Luther King, we may have come over on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We need to get it together. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Blunt Rochester. Senator Marino.
Chairman, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time on the phone the other day. Appreciate that very much. Just to ask you a broad general question. When you increase M2, the money supply, by 40% over a short period of time, is that going to drive inflation?
It could. Well, I think we discussed, monetary aggregates have not been a great predictor of really any other thing. But I think when there's a sharp increase like that in M2, then that could, that's something that might cause some inflation.
Now, is that just to be clear for the people watching, that happened because of public policy in this institution here, correct? In other words, there wasn't a civilian-led effort to increase government spending outside of the elected leaders that chose to make those decisions.
I think that was part of it. I think there were just a lot of causes in the inflation that we saw, but that, it's fiscal policy, it was monetary policy, it was just closing and reopening the economy, just generated a bunch of confusing signals and then a lot of inflation everywhere in the world, really, whether people did a lot of fiscal policy or not. So there were many factors, and that's, I would say, one of them.
But just to be clear, it wasn't the citizens of the country making those decisions. Those were elected leaders choosing to close the economy. Businesses didn't decide one day to close, didn't decide to not be able to go to work. Those were decisions made by policymakers, correct?
Yes.
So it's a little disingenuous to be hear my colleagues talk about how they care so much about inflation when in reality they caused it. But I don't want to continue that. I'd ask you a question just out of curiosity, because you worked at the Department of Treasury. At what point did you think they were going to run out of ink? Did that concern you, that maybe it was possible that they were printing so much money that the Treasury would have to find alternate ink suppliers?
Didn't occur to me, but good question.
So along those lines, something that concerns me a lot is the idea that we would even look like China in any way. So can I have your commitment that as long as you're the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, that we will never have a central bank digital currency?
Yes.
Thank you for that. I think that's extremely important. It makes me very happy to hear you say that. Shifting gears to a little bit, something that matters to me and entrepreneurs all over the country is, why can't I wire somebody money at 6 p.m. Eastern time? Can we get to a 24/7 scenario where wires are cleared every day, all day? I think that would be very, very helpful to businesses all over the country.
So that's coming. It's just coming slowly here. We have that at FedNow. We'll get in touch with you about FedNow. We provide that service between two banks, and others want to provide it too. But yes, we do kind of lag a lot of other countries in that, and it is time for that to happen.
So I know I don't want to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot, FedNow was very familiar with it, but it was a little bit late in coming. Can we get a commitment to do that this year so that by the end of this calendar year, businesses can transact 24/7 and settle payments?
I think they can do that now I believe they can do it now on FedNow, and they can also do it on the RTP system as well. So I think it's available. Let me check in and I'll follow up with you.
That'd be great. Now, one other piece of the puzzle here is what do you think the Fed can do to fight international terror groups? For example, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the proxies that are funded by places like Qatar. Do you think that we're doing enough to keep them outside of the banking system? Because at the end of the day, terrorism is ultimately funded by these bad actors. I met with the hostage families this morning. It was heart-wrenching to hear stories about kids that are my kids' age being held for almost 500 days. The Qataris are obviously completely complicit in all this. What can we do? What advice would you have that we can do to make certain that we bring these terror groups to their knees?
You know, we do enforce the money laundering laws very, very strictly, and but it's a tough question. You know, it's a huge focus in international meetings and things like that. But you're right; it's really hard to nail it down, particularly if it's all happening overseas. But we can do what we can do with our banks. We don't want to make it so costly, though, that they debank people because they're so worried about violating the anti-money laundering laws. I mean, that's some of what's happening, according to the banks, is that they're so afraid that there might be money laundering that they just cut people off at the first flag, as opposed to perfectly legal businesses are being, thrown out because of their fear of being caught doing money laundering. So I think there's a balance there, but no, it's a really, really hard project and one we spend a lot of time on.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Marino. The patient and persistent Senator Kim.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure some of my colleagues had a chance to be able to run off to some of their meetings, and I've enjoyed being able to listen to the chairman, to be able to hear some of your articulation here. I just want to share with you, I did a telephone town hall last night, and I'm glad to hear some of my other colleagues as well. And there is a lot of anxiety right now by the American people in trying to understand what's happening and seeing and interpreting what's happening on the news. I guess I just wanted to ask you, if you were, for your words of how you would explain to the American people the importance of independence when it comes to the Federal Reserve.
So I think the point is that we'll make better policy, we'll keep inflation lower if we just focus on doing our job and stay out of politics, stay out of elections, don't try to favor or to hurt any political party, any political figure, just focus on the data. If we start putting up political filters, we'll be no good, we'll be less effective at our already quite difficult job. And I do think that's broadly understood. I think there's broad support up here in both political parties and on both sides of the Hill. I think that there is a decent degree of support for continued independence. That's not to say we shouldn't be accountable. We should be very accountable and transparent about what we do. We should be up here explaining what we do and why to our oversight body, which is this committee and then the same committee on the House side. So that's what I would say.
Making decisions about your core mission about stability and about growth, but not thinking about it in terms of the context of an election cycle, for instance. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
I wanted to just shift gears a little bit, but similar type topic. There's been a lot of attention to the role of public servants within our government and, our understanding what roles they play, how many to have. And I guess I just wanted to ask if you could speak to the role of the Federal Reserve employees, their qualifications, and more importantly, like their importance to the mission and being able to engage. How important are they to the work that you are trying to do towards stability and growth?
So I'm very proud to be associated with the people of the Federal Reserve, and I'll give you an example why. When the pandemic hit, kind of out of the blue, and economies all over the world are shutting down, the U.S. Treasury market is stopping to function, companies can't roll over their commercial paper. Economists are writing about a depression. People at the Fed who went through the global financial crisis 10 years before step forward and say, we got this. We know what to do. Here's what we do with the Treasury market. Here's what we do with money market funds. Here's what we do with the companies that can't get any financing. The markets were closed, and companies were having maturing debt that they had to roll over. The people who knew what to do in that pretty dire emergency were working at the Federal Reserve and other places. But I will tell you, it was impressive. And I think if you could have seen it, the way people react and how hard they work and how much they know and how well it worked, really. Our work during the acute phase of the crisis was very successful, and it's entirely due to the knowledge base that resides with career people at the Fed.
Yeah. Would you say that the Fed is overstaffed?
No, I would say that, overworked, maybe not overstaffed. Everybody at the Fed works really hard. It's a place where people work.
And a lot of this conversation right now about staffing numbers at different departments and agencies, it's going back to this sense of the taxpayer dollar, in terms of accountability there. But I guess I just wanted to ask you, is the Fed paid for by the taxpayer dollars? Can you explain to us what the burden is on the taxpayer?
So we're self-funding through our large balance sheet.
So when it comes to the staffing at the Federal Reserve, not coming from the taxpayers, is that right?
Indirectly, we give away all of our profits. We give back to Treasury, and those profits would be higher if we didn't pay for the Fed. So in fairness, it's ultimately paid for by the taxpayer. But in that sense, we're self-funded.
Self-funded.
Yeah.
Just one last question here. You talked about the different actors that are involved when it comes to levying tariffs in terms of paying that the exporter, the importer, the consumer. You said middlemen could be part of that. I guess I just wanted to ask you, do you know of any way in which to 100% guarantee that the consumers will not have to pay higher costs when it comes to tariffs?
Not really. It's not going to be easy to identify with any accuracy exactly where costs do fall, but I think it'd be hard to guarantee any particular outcome. I think we're just going to have to see.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Warren, did you?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a point before we quit here, and that is about law enforcement. If you keep the laws the same on the books, but you fire the cops, you're going to have a lot more crime. That's kind of law enforcement 101. And the problem we've got right now is law in the books about consumer protection hasn't changed. But the cops, at least right at this moment, have been told at CFPB to stand down. And I appreciate that we have state AGs who step in, and often they partner up with the CFPB. But there is no one else for the giant banks who actually does what's called the bank examination, the supervision. And that is so important. Remember the Wells Fargo scandal, where Wells Fargo was illegally opening fake accounts in people's names? You find that through bank examination, not because the person who got cheated could figure it out. Bank of America gets hauled in because bank examiners discovered they were charging people illegally on junk fees. Nobody finds that but the people who are down in the banks doing the bank examination on behalf of the consumers. Look, we tried a patchwork of law enforcement for consumers before 2008. We had all those laws scattered among 7 different agencies, and we saw how it ended. It ended with millions of people losing their homes, millions of people losing their jobs, millions of people losing their savings. The CFPB is our law enforcement agency to make sure that the giant banks follow the rules on consumer protection. And for me, right now, I'd be really worried about doing business with a giant bank when there's no cop on the beat.
Thank you, Senator. I will recognize myself for just one question, and it'll even be relevant to your job, I promise, Mr. Chairman. So thank you for your patience and for being here. I wanted to follow up on there were some questions, or at least I know Senator Rounds asked a Basel III question, and your response was basically, let's get the people in place from the administration, and then we'll proceed again. Treasury Secretary Besson recently said that the banking system is, I believe, said, quote, well capitalized, perhaps overcapitalized, unquote. And given that assessment, or if you agree with it, could you discuss the necessity of advancing a new Basel III proposal, specifically how an updated regulation would impact the ability of the regional banks to compete with the big Wall Street banks, and what considerations should be taken into account to ensure that we have a competitive banking system? Because I know there's this concern comes and goes, and for those of us who have largely regional banks, or God love them, the best of all, community banks and credit unions, a competitive system is really important. So if you could just answer that, and then I'll wrap up.
Sure. So we're eager to get together with new colleagues from the FDIC, new leadership at the FDIC and the OCC, to try to finish Basel III. My own view has been that our banks are well capitalized, and Basel III was not supposed to be an exercise in raising capital in U.S. banks. Mario Draghi said that. Dan Tarullo said that back in the day, I believe. So I think that's about right. We have some work to do, but we'll get there, I believe, fairly quickly. In terms of your regionals, they don't face the G-SIB surcharges. They don't face quite the burden that the large banks face on resolution planning and that sort of thing. So we need those banks to be healthy and profitable, because we need them to compete with the G-SIBs. We don't want a world where the G-SIBs just keep getting a bigger and bigger share of the economy. That's not what we're looking for, and that's what a lot of pressure. We've seen the number of community banks, especially, declining for 30 years.
Yes.
And this is not something we want to. We don't want to be the cause of that. If it's happening by natural causes or because of evolving technology, that's one thing. But we don't want to be inadvertently causing that to happen.
So as you look at a Basel III exercise, can you think of anything specifically that ensures that competitive, diverse banking system is maintained rather than a consolidation, whether it's fewer community banks into more regional banks, or fewer regional banks into more Wall Street banks?
Well, I just think you think twice before you impose the kinds of things that we impose on the largest banks and the next to largest banks. You want to be careful not to just think we should do exactly the same thing. It's what tends to happen is, so for smaller banks, it raises the fixed costs, is what it does, of banking, and it makes it harder to start new banks, and makes it harder for any but the largest to be successful. So that's not what we want. We want a lot of competition, and these regionals. It's important that they thrive.
I agree, and I agree with your assessment. So thank you for that. Thank you for staying with us for the day, and glad we could get you first. So as we wrap up, for senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Tuesday, February 18th. Chair Powell, you have 45 days from that day to submit your response to questions for the record. Thank you. The committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.
Atención, últimas noticias. Grandes noticias. La bolsa de Wall Street supera sus máximos históricos. ¿Te perdiste la subida histórica del S&P 500? ¿No invertiste en las empresas de inteligencia artificial cuando podías? ¿No te enteraste de la crisis de Grifols a tiempo? Esto es que no te estás enterando de lo que pasa en los mercados. Ahora puedes enterarte gratis en la mayor comunidad gratuita de traders en español. Únete a nuestro Telegram y entérate de todo antes de que sea demasiado tarde. Chat con traders reales. Noticias. Métricas y análisis. Escenarios financieros diarios. Una gran comunidad de trading en español. Telegram privado de TradingPRO abajo en la descripción. Es el momento de enterarte de lo que pasa.
Inversión, macro, bolsa, cripto y mercados. En Más que Mercados, analizamos la actualidad, las últimas noticias y todos los factores que afectan a tus inversiones.
La educación financiera cambia vidas.
De lunes a jueves a las 3:30 p.m. hora española, el mejor programa de economía, inversión y trading de habla hispana. Cada día podrás ver la operativa en vivo y en directo. Acompáñanos con la guía experta de José y Álvaro Basagoiti y analiza con nuestros invitados las mejores estrategias de inversión y los portafolios corporativos de su firma. También podrás hacer tus propias consultas sobre acciones y mercados en tiempo real. Únete a nosotros de lunes a jueves a las 3:30 hora española y no te pierdas las mejores entrevistas e invitados. Descubre cómo hacer crecer tu patrimonio de manera inteligente solo en Más que Mercados de TradingPRO TV.